Good afternoon. In compliance with Chapter 551 of the Open Meetings Act of the Texas Government Code, I call to order a public hearing meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Austin Independent School District for Monday, January 25th, 2021 at 5:42 p.m. A quorum of the board, along with a limited number of our staff members, are physically present at AISD headquarters to conduct this meeting. In addition, we have a majority of our staff joining us by video. We are following necessary health protocols to ensure the safety of those who are here in person. But please keep in mind, we are continuing to comply with local health orders and CDC guidance. And so we're not yet able to open our meetings to in-person attendance by our full staff and community. We will be continuing to use the virtual platform until it is safe to do otherwise. This meeting is streaming live on AISD TV and Apple TV. It is also being broadcast on cable channel 22 through Spectrum, Grande, Google Fiber TV, and on channel 99 through AT&T Uverse. Closed captioning in English is available on these platforms for the hearing impaired. And to our audience tuning in remotely, welcome and thank you for joining us. We will move to the approval of the agenda. Secretary Singh, do you have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Having a motion by Secretary Singh and a second by Trustee Anderson to approve the agenda, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. And the motion passes by all those on the dais. Dr. Elizalde, I think the next item on the agenda is the 2019-2020 Texas Academic Performance Report.
Thank you, President Rodriguez. Trustees, as is required by law, we are having a public meeting to discuss what is known as the Texas Academic Performance Report. You'll also hear referred to as TAPER. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our Chief Academic Officer, Elizabeth Casas.
Good evening. Let me get myself situated. Okay. Good evening, President Rodriguez, Superintendent Elizalde, and Board of Trustees. I also have a team on here to help me answer any questions. I have Carolyn Henshin from our Evaluation and Accountability Department that can also support us. Okay, next slide, please. This overview will provide a summary of the components of the annual report and a link to the items that make up the complete report. Austin ISD's annual report for the school year 2019-2020 is posted on the district website, and the availability of the report will be announced to district families through School Messenger. The report in its entirety will also be available at Austin Central Library. The annual report itself is over 2,000 pages long. This presentation provides an overview of the annual report and contains links to the required components of the report. Next slide, please. Here you see the components of the report that are prescribed by law. The report must contain the district's accreditation status, the Texas Academic Performance Reports for the district and each campus, the district's PEIMS financial report, campus performance objectives, a report on violent and criminal incidents, and a report on post-secondary readiness. Next slide. Next slide, district accreditation. The district status for school year 1920 is accredited. The Financial Integrity Rating System of Texas, or FIRST, we got an A superior rating, and the special education status for school year 2019 is meets requirements. Due to the disruptions caused by COVID-19 pandemic in the spring of 2020, the Texas Commission of Education assigned a label of not rated declared state of disaster to all Texas schools and districts for the 1920 school year. No state ratings were assigned for the year. Next slide, please. Okay. The Texas Academic Performance Reports, or the TAPER, make up the bulk of each district's annual report. The Texas Education Agency creates a taper report for each campus and district in the state. And these are the components of the taper report, which includes STAR, attendance, college career military readiness, student information, staff information, PEIMS financial report, and a comprehensive glossary so you can understand what all the components are and how they're calculated. Next slide, please. In most years, the bulk of the taper report is devoted to the State of Texas Assessment of Academic Readiness, or the STAR. STAR is the state's testing program for students in grades 3 and up. STAR tests are designed to measure the students' learning at each grade level in math, English, language arts, reading, science, and social studies. Because of the cancellation of STAR in the spring of 2019 due to COVID-19 pandemic, the taper does not contain any student performance data for the 1920 school year. The performance section of the taper was not updated with this information, but instead contains STAR results for school years 2017-18 and 18-19. Because these results were presented in last year's annual reports, they will not be reported in this year's summary report. Next slide. Some of the indicators in the taper are what are called lagging indicators. That means that because of timing issues in the collection of the data and the release of the taper report, the data are not for the most recently passed school year, but rather for the year before. In the 2020 taper report includes attendance rates for school years 2018, 2019. The overall attendance rate for school year 18-19 was 95%, slightly higher than the previous year. Attendance was the highest for our Asian student group at 97.4% and the lowest for African American students at 93.2%. Next slide. Graduation rates are another lagging indicator. The four-year longitudinal graduation rate for the class of 2019 was 94.5, up 0.5% from the prior year. 2019 graduation rates for student groups ranged from a low of 85.7 for students served in receiving special education and a high of 97.2% for students in 2 or more races. And you have the data for the other student groups. Next slide, please. Students who achieve any one of a number of indicators are recognized for having achieved college, career, or military readiness. The indicators include reaching a certain level of performance in math and reading on ACT, SAT, TSIA exams, or college prep courses, attainment of an industry-based certification from the Commissioner's approved list, earning an associate degree or earning a certain level of college credit while in high school, attaining a certain criteria for AP or IB test, or enrollment in the military. Next slide, please. In addition to the indicators shown in the taper, the district's Department of Research and Evaluation prepares a report on college readiness by campus, which is available through a link on this summary page. Next slide. The taper report includes the district's racial profile. The enrollment for 2019-2020 was 80,718. Hispanic students made up the largest student group at 55.3%, followed by white students at 29.8%, African American students at 6.9%, and students of 2 or more races at 3.4%. Next slide. 53% of the students in Austin ISD are eligible for free or reduced price meals. Over 28.2% are English learners or emergent bilinguals, and nearly half meet the criteria for at risk. And you see on the right, the program enrollment shows that 31% participate in bilingual ESL education, 29.7% are CTE, 10.9% are in GT programs, and 12.8% are served through special education. Next slide, please. The report also gives us information on teachers. So of the 5,478 teachers in Austin ISD, 57% are white, 32.9% are Hispanic, 5.7% are African American, 2.6% Asian, and 1.4% are 2 or more races. Fewer than 0.5% are American Indian or Pacific Islander. Next slide, please. The report also looks at teacher by experience. And here you see that 29% of our teachers had 1 to 5 years experience, while 25.4% had 11 to 20 years of experience. 13% of our teachers were in their first year of teaching, while almost 15% had 20 years or more experience. The next section is the financial report. The financial data reported on the PEMS gives a comprehensive report of the district's financial status. One of the notable numbers in the financial report is the amount of recapture funds that the district sends to the state, over $665 million for the 2018-2019, by far the most paid by any district in the state. Next slide, please. And here you see the monetary disbursements. And again, worth noting, the recapture payment to the state was about 48% of our general fund. And then you see the disbursements in the other categories. Next slide, please. The performance objectives. The campus performance objectives are based on the district's strategic plan, which can be accessed through the link in the annual report summary. And again, we don't have performance reports by the state for the district or the campuses. Next slide, please. In addition, the performance objectives are outlined in the district scorecard. Performance indicators from the district scorecard are rolled down to the campus level and incorporated into each campus improvement plan. Next slide. The next section is on violent criminal incident report. Here you see the number of violent criminal incidents for the 2019-2020 school year were down 180 incidents, or about 16%. That change is due in large part by the switch to remote instruction in March of 2020 due to the outbreak of COVID. Next slide. While we were not able to get additional information on the demographics of the offenses, here you see the categories, noting that drug offenses resulted in the highest number of disciplinary placements. And again, these are the non-discretionary that require a disciplinary placement outside of the school. Next slide. Post-secondary performance. Next slide. Also included in the annual report is the status of high school graduates from Texas Higher Education Board. Slightly over half of Texas high school class of the 2018 were reported enrolled in a Texas 2 or 4 year public university or independent colleges in the year following graduation. This is about the same as the prior year. And so here you see that this only tracks the students that have enrolled in a Texas 2 or 4 year college or private university. The not trackable or not found could be students that have enrolled in schools outside of Texas or have not enrolled at all. Next slide. And here you see the breakdown of the demographics of the graduates. And so the way to read this is, of the 51% that graduated, looking at each student group, this is a percent of students that we have record that is tracked through the Texas Higher Ed Board. So if you look at the first one, African-American students, of the number of students that graduated, the number is really small, the 51-point-something% of those, we have record of them either attending a 2 or a 4 year public university or independent college. Next slide, please. The Texas Higher Education Board also tracks performance of students. So here you see that 55% of the class of 2018 maintained a GPA of 3.0 or higher. You see that outlined in the red at the top right. Okay, next slide. And that was a very high-level overview of the TAPER report.
Thank you, Ms. Casas. President Rodriguez.
Thank you, Dr. Elizalde. Trustees, any questions? Trustee Anderson?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Does it not track students who decide they want to attend a vocational school? Is it just solely 2 or 4-year college, not vocational?
Carolyn, if you're on here, I think she can give us a little bit more information, but it's my understanding it's a 2 or 4-year or any independent or private university or college.
Good evening, trustees. Yes, the state report, the Texas Higher Education Board report that is part of the annual report only tracks 2 or 4-year or independent colleges in Texas. We do a more in-depth report internally through our Department of Research and Evaluation, and we can provide a link to a report that has more. I believe it includes vocational schools, but it also includes out-of-state schools as reported by the college board.
Thank you.
That's a link that we can embed in this report and send to you as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Trustee Boswell.
Hi, thank you, Ms. Casas, for that report. I appreciate it. I have a question about data I was surprised to see how level the 2 and 4-year college data was, given just news reports I had heard about what happened with COVID and students feeling like fewer students feeling like that was an option. Do you see data in this report that can help make decisions on campuses with students, with advising for what happens next fall with students graduating this year?
Before we answer
I think
that,
one thing,
hang on, Ms.
Go ahead.
Casas, I just want to be clear to remember, and if you'll help me, which data are the lag indicators, because I would like to know how far
Thank you.
back those are to address Trustee Boswell's question.
Whether that was 1819 or 1920.
Correct.
That would be helpful to know. Thank you.
yes, so this does use the 2017, 2018 data and the
Got it.
2018, 2019 data. So it's
Okay.
still 2 years behind.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay.
But I think it'll be great for us to already look to see what that will compare, because I know that Carolyn in our department, they do a great job of looking at that data prior. So thank you for that, and we'll start working on seeing if we can get some early indicators about what effect COVID may have had on some of those registrations and enrollments for post-secondary.
Thank you.
Trustees, any other, Trustee Singh?
Thank you so much for this presentation, very helpful. You did make mention of the strategic plan, and so I was curious to know, when the administration sees things like the discrepancies in attendance and college enrollment and things like growth on the STAR test, how do you use this data to help formulate your strategic plan?
Ms. Casas, I'll start off, and then you can jump in along with Dr. Mays or anyone else who may want to add. So at this period of time, what we will typically do, and we will be doing that here, is we'll then schedule an internal work session retreat where we do our needs assessment from this data, and then we dive deeper. We'll get our expertise from Carolyn and her team, because clearly this is just top-level data. And then, so we disaggregate it, for instance, by campus, down to the classroom level, because we could have something that may look like we have a systemic issue, but in fact it's not. It could be something that's being, we have some issues at a particular school or particular schools, right? And so similar to, I think when we talked about like discipline referrals, and what that data revealed is we didn't have that issue across every campus. There were certain campuses that need additional supports in order for us to serve our students. So it's really important that we not look at data from a 30,000-foot view and stop. And I'm going to use my biology analogy. You start on that 40x, but then we go all the way down to the 400x. You want to get down and magnify, but we have to start at the top, and then we can dive deep. So from that, we will do a needs assessment. We'll put together then a strategic plan that needs to align not only with the data, but the our district's strategic framework. So we'll work to see how we can align those two pieces.
Okay, thank you. And do you know when that process will start?
Well, we just scheduled, I know Ms. Cordova just scheduled a meeting. I think it's next week when we're getting together to start our first work session.
Okay, great.
You must have read my mind, because that's exactly what we did
Okay.
today. Was when are we meeting? We got to start digging into the data.
Okay, great. And do you know why the taper does not include data from the class of 2020? I would have thought that some of that would be there, but do they always lag?
So any
That
data that
much?
are for the end of the school year, there's not sufficient time for the data to be scrubbed. So
Okay.
you always have those as a 1 year. So that's why in 2020, you're not going to get any data from that school year. You're not
Okay.
going to get, because they're still cleaning up that data. So you're
Okay.
always, all these years, you've always been looking at current STAR data or whatever state assessment. But then all of the data regarding like graduations, all of that have always been a year lag.
Okay, great. And then if people want to see the taper for their own campus, where could they find that?
That's also on the website, either through the Texas Education Agency. They have a search bar. You don't even have to type the full name of the school. If you just type the name, you don't put elementary or middle, it'll show up. If the same school name is listed in different school districts, it'll show you that, and you can click and it'll show you either to be able to watch it in HTML, or if you'd like a PDF so that you could print it. Either of those are available. Are we also making these available on any of our, they should be on our campus websites. We'll be working on that, Dr. Mays?
We can make it available on the report or on the website, and so that's not something that we can't take care of pretty quickly.
I think it would be helpful so that parents don't have to go search somewhere else. If we can put the link and work with our technology department to help us with those websites, that's one less thing. I don't, if I'm a parent and I'm trying to like, where do I navigate? So if it's easily put the link there on our campus websites, I think that would really help out.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
We'll take care of it.
And my last question for you, Dr. Elizalde, is just like, as the superintendent of the district, what are some of the big takeaways for you from this taper report?
I think, not surprisingly, the biggest takeaways are that we have, and I like to use the words student groups rather than subgroups, because as a Latina, I don't like to say I'm sub to anybody. So it's one of those, but the student groups clearly show a lot of disparity. And so we're going to need to work on identifying what are the supports that are necessary. We don't want to lower anyone's performance. We want to raise the performance of students who need those supports. And I think we're positioned well with our Board of Trustees to have the support to be able to do that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, trustees. Any other questions? Trustee Zapata?
So I have a couple of questions. Just if you could help clarify this, was this Ms. Casas that reported? I don't see the documents you have. As just for the audience, I'm visually impaired, so I'm going by my notes. So you can correct me if I misstate this, but I wrote down as you began talking about the population, 80,718, and then you started breaking down 53% or free and reduced lunch, and then you go on, and then you say 12, was it 12.8 SPED students? Was that the right number you said?
I believe so. In that year, 12 point, let me look at my notes, 12% of the, 12 point,
It was 12.8% of our
Okay.
students were identified as special education.
Okay, all right. 'cause-
receiving special education services.
Oh, so that's for 2018, not now, because, I mean, I've heard from the community how we have such a big backlog of students being tested, and so they're not, so if this is 2018, so they're not even reflected yet.
No, this isn't 2018 data. this actually would be, Carolyn, can you correct us and make sure we're on, because I think this particular data is reflective of the previous year. So this would be reflective of the 1920 school year, is that
Oh,
correct?
okay. So
Yes,
the,
2018.
so what I'm hearing about the backlog of students that haven't been tested may not be in this number then, right? Because they haven't been tested.
That's correct.
Okay. So I think that's something, I mean, that's an issue that there's such a backlog. I'm hearing a year and a half backlog. Students waiting to be tested, and we're in violation of, by law, so that this can be an accurate number. That's,
I could add that is a high priority, is getting through that backlog. When the districts all shut down for COVID, we were not allowed to do face-to-face evaluations.
right.
And so now that we're open and up and running, then we're working as quickly as we can to get those processed.
right, and, I'm hearing also that in addition to that, what would be helpful is the number of the an analyst that do those testing. There's like one analyst to 7 schools, which is unrealistic to even catch up. So maybe that's an area we can talk about for how do we move that process. So the other question was on the criminal report. You said we were 180 less number of students that had gotten in trouble due to, being remote. But then you mentioned that most of the majority of the offenses were drug-related, but that they were outside of school. Can you explain what that means? Does that mean they got in trouble and went to juvie and they're not in the schools no more? What does that mean? I don't know.
So this indicator is looking at the offenses that require a disciplinary placement. So these happen at school or school property, and then because of that, they are expelled or sent to like the alternative school or juvenile justice system.
Okay. All right. And is there a way to track them after that they were, when they return, just to see how we're helping those students get back on track?
I honestly have not dug deeply into what that is.
Okay.
The best practice would be that as soon as a student is reintegrated into their campus, that there's a plan put in place for the students so that they can safely get reintegrated into their school system. Dr. Mays, do you know a little more about that?
Yeah, and I was actually going to say that's correct. I'm actually working with Mr. Jones, our director, and Paul Perez and student discipline to try to refine these processes so we can make sure that we are able to track those processes. And we actually are looking at some individual students to kind of track their process right now. But we do want to have systems developed to be able to collect the data as we move forward with addressing this process. And so these are conversations that we are actually having right now.
Great. Thank you.
And to your point, it's part of a bigger process. We're having all the departments work together. We've got the counseling department, our MTSS coaches, we've got the learning school center teachers, we've got the mental health providers, the threat assessment, and there's a lot of layers that we're trying to work through to create a continuum of services so that everybody knows what to do. When does a teacher hand it off to the counselor? When does a counselor hand it off to a mental health provider? So that everybody's clear about how do we support our students so that they're successful in our schools.
Thank you, Trustee Zapata. Any other trustees that have not yet asked a question that want to ask a question before I recognize Trustee Ashley, before I recognize Trustee Anderson?
Thank you so much. And I just had one question, and I'm assuming based on the answer that you gave previously, Dr. Elzalde, that this is something that we will probably get answered as you dive into the information. But of course, the one that probably jumped out at me the most was the one that had the biggest difference in the colored bars, which was the longitudinal graduation rates of our special education students. And I didn't know if you had information that you could share about that, or if that is something that you'll be examining in your deeper dive, that maybe we could receive information about that later.
I'm going to see how much Ms. Casas, who joined us mid-October, and see how much she can provide us. This is an area of high priority. And so we are, as this is being presented to you all because this just came out. And so as soon as it comes out, we present it to you. We have not done our work session of digging into the data yet to answer. So many of the questions that I've heard here are the same questions certainly that we have, and we'll be able to come back and provide some information. Ms. Casas, do you have something you can add for us with regard to that data that is really disheartening when we see our special education students?
The only thing I would add is that students are allowed to continue until they're 21 years old, and so I don't know how that impacts our enrollment in the universities and the colleges, but definitely this is a hot priority. Also, as we think about our career academies, how are we making those accessible also to our students who are receiving special education services? So it is worthy of a much deeper discussion in the services that we provide to make sure that our kids have access to whatever they want to be successful and independent, productive citizens.
Thank you. And that's, I think, I knew that was, that I felt comfortable that was your answer, that this would be information that would be coming to us later. I just wanted to be able to make sure that our community understands that this is information that you guys are just getting as well. And so you may not have the answers right now, and that obviously we have questions immediately, and I know that means you have questions immediately. So I do look forward to hearing what you find out in your deeper dive on that. And I think we, as a board, have demonstrated our interest in special education as a whole. And so wanted to make sure that we brought that up as well. So thank you.
Trustee Anderson.
Dr. Elizalde, if you would please, excuse me, can you please provide some, I don't want to say an article, but I don't want it to, I know there is a shortage of evaluators to do the actual testing across the country. So can you please provide something that speaks to that effect? And I think the bigger issue is, why are mass numbers of students being referred to special education? Let's start there. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, and you are correct. There are many layers that we need to really pull back, starting from how can we intervene earlier prior to students needing to be identified as special needs. In some instances, these are results of us not intervening and providing what's necessary earlier on. And in other situations, it's the process of being identified is also very, can be very convoluted and very difficult. So following a flow chart of how a student is referred, what do we do when students are struggling, this is the whole process. I think Ms. Casas alluded to, for instance, we have MTSS coordinators, and these are to provide assistance in intervening. But if they're all of these working in silos rather than working jointly into which area supports another area, what we have is a lot of staff team members working very hard, but they're working in their own single areas. And it's incumbent upon us, not them, to bring everybody together so that we can support the work and in fact then serve students, more students, and do so in a more effective manner.
And you mentioned that coordinator. A lot of people don't know what that.
MTSS.
Yes.
Give me that acronym because I forget it as well, Ms. Casas.
Multi-tiered systems of support.
That's what I was going to say.
Thank you.
Trustees, any other, Trustee Singh?
sorry. I have a couple of other things, if you don't mind. And I know you, just as Trustee Ashley said, you guys just got your eyes on this. And so there are a couple of things that kind of jumped out to me that I would love for the administration to address when you report back to us on the strategic plan. I'm looking at the actual TAPER report on page 9 of the TAPER report. We see the school progress domain, which is the academic growth score by grade and subject. So it covers like all the grades and reading and math subjects. And I was disappointed to see, as I'm sure you were, that our African American and our Hispanic students lag behind white and Asian students pretty much on every single metric, every subject, every year that's listed here. And that's something we have control of as a district. You know, it's one thing to have absolute scores lower, although that's not okay either. But I start getting worried when I see there's uneven growth as well among student groups. So first, tell me if I'm interpreting that correctly. And secondly, just if that's something that you guys will be able to share with us when we work on the strategic plan, how this specifically would be addressed.
So my apologies if I wasn't, when you asked me the first question, what did I take away from this? And I said
Yeah.
the disparities in our student groups. This is exactly what I was referring to, is the fact that we don't even need to, we need to compare to a standard, right? Like, this is good performance. So all our students need to be at that performance. And so if other groups of students continue to improve, that's great. But we have to have disproportionate gain for our African American students, for our Hispanic students, for our economically disadvantaged, for our special ed students, in a way that demonstrates we truly understand what accelerated curriculum and accelerated instruction is, and that we be able to discern that down to the student level. This has to be based on student individual needs, so we need to do this earlier, first and foremost. But we also can't say to students that are in upper grades, well, we're going to start early, so we missed you. We have to intervene at each of these areas. And so it is absolutely, I don't want there to be any doubt, that will absolutely be an area of focus in our strategic plan, and we'd welcome, of course, your feedback.
Thank you. And just one more thing, and Trustee Anderson, when you were talking about vocational schools, that made me think of that. I would be really curious as well to see, so I just want to kind of second what she said, is I would be curious to see something that shows what percentage of our students by student group go to 2-year, 4-year vocational, or if get an associate's degree while they're enrolled as students. Because I believe the Chamber of Commerce, when they're looking at the Direct to College 70, I think that's how they're grouping it as well. So I want to be able to just get that proper number, because I don't think we have that in any of our reports, and I don't think the TAPER is set up that way either.
It is definitely not in the actual TAPER report. It is necessary for House Bill 3 and for some
Okay.
of that funding. And so I know Carolyn and her team are already looking at how to pull that. But we'll make sure, again,
Cool.
that all of the different perspectives and thoughts that you all have are represented. There isn't any
Great.
reason, we should be able to pull the data
Great.
as close as possible with all that information.
Thank you.
Trustee Lu, and then Trustee Zapata.
So I have a quick follow-up question that will probably take a little bit of time to get a response back on, but Dr. Mays mentioned that he and Paul Perez and I think the ALC principal are working on tracking progress for reintegration of students after they've been expelled and how to reintegrate them. One question that I'm hoping that maybe we can get an answer to is, when looking at data regarding which students or which campuses have students that are arrested for drug offenses, that might kind of help us identify some patterns where, you know, it wouldn't be a surprise to, I think, most of us in our community to see that maybe at some campuses the parents or the guardians are called and said, hey, you know, Johnny had a joint, versus at other campuses, it might have involved calling law enforcement.
I'm not sure I follow the question.
Sure, so data regarding which campuses have arrests of students for drug offenses versus which campuses might not.
Oh.
Yep.
So, action taken based on the offense so that we can compare whether students from different campuses with
Whether
the
there's
same
a pattern.
offense are getting treated the same way. Is that, am I
Right,
following
whether
that
there's
correctly?
some disparities in
Yeah.
outcomes.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I do think it's a little challenging to tease it out, but it's not impossible. And it's absolutely something that I think Dr. Mays, again, is working with as we continue to just start to pull things like some of the students that have been assigned for excessive number of days. And we were just comparing, what did that look like based on the demographics of the students?
Yeah.
And so we just started to really to uncover some of those, but those are absolutely things that we're working on, Trustee Lugo, and I feel confident that we'll be able to bring you back some of that information as we're working on the strategic plan.
Great, thank you.
Trustee Zapata?
Okay, I have a question. So I'm trying to understand, the TAPER report, is that information used in giving the school a grade? that
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Okay. So it is going to be real important then for schools to have their own parent community meeting about their results.
As a matter of fact, the requirement is that campuses also have to make this available. And then depending on what your actual rating, your grade is, whether you actually have to have a community meeting or not, but all of this information must be made available to the public.
Okay. Well, I think it's good if they did good or bad, they should share it in public, because it's a way to celebrate also. We don't want to just, these are, our schools are hurting, but what can we do as a community for those that are needing to do more work, and those that have been doing work, for them to also publicly, with their communities, say, continue to work with us, or, to bring that community togetherness, that we still need to keep working together to improve our schools. So I was curious about that. The other thing was, I know the response is because of COVID that, we got behind, but a year and a half behind is not the whole time we've been in COVID. So I know that there's got to be other, I guess, try to find out what the processes are for the outcomes of this, everything on here. What are the processes in place now for accountability for us to be able to compare for next year when we get our next report, if that makes sense?
Yes, ma'am, and that's exactly what Ms. Casas is being held accountable and responsible for as she digs into that, into the department in terms of what exactly is it that we need. We were short on evaluators as an example, rather than trying to see, are we gonna get any? There is a shortage of evaluators across the state. We can't use that as a reason. So instead, then we utilize some consulting services so that we can get caught up with those services. Because our students need to have those assessments done so that they can have proper IEPs, proper ARD meetings, they can be serviced well when they've been identified, and you're absolutely correct. There were some challenges prior to COVID with regard to the assessments in SPED prior to my arrival, and we're going to work together to make sure that we get that. And you're going to be hearing from us on what we're discovering. We certainly don't want to just jump to any conclusions about what is or isn't wrong. We want to make sure we identify it properly, because we don't want to put in a solution to something that isn't the proper area that we'll actually get results from. So we know we have to go fast, but we also know we have to get it right.
Right.
So we're working together, and we should be bringing you some reports on special ed in the next 2 board meetings.
Well, just one comment to that is, and I know that consultants are helpful, very expensive, but also accountability of leadership. You know, it's also checking into what is our leadership doing, and not jump just to consultants, but accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Anderson.
Leadership can only do what they are allowed to do under the previous administration. Thank you.
Thank you, trustees. Any other questions? If not, the next item is an opportunity for the public to share comments with the board. This time allows speakers to comment publicly regarding the Texas Academic Performance Report. In order to accommodate our video conference format, members of the public wishing to participate in the public hearing portion of our meeting called a dedicated AISD phone line in advance of the meeting and audio recorded their remarks. We will now play those recordings, so please listen carefully. I understand we had 2 individuals who signed up to speak.
My name is Lisa Flores. I'm calling about board public hearing item 2.1. I would just like to say that the 4-year state longitudinal graduation rates for students receiving special education have dropped, and there is no metric in our scorecard to improve this. So, I mean, we see that this is data, but there is no scorecard metric to improve this outcome, to improve graduation. Furthermore, I would like for intergovernmental charges to be explained and broken down, as this is a sizable expenditure that no one seems to know what it is. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Candace Hunter, and I'm providing testimony about the Texas Academic Performance Report. I hope when viewing the paper document that you were disheartened as I was to see the opportunity gap that still remains among students of Austin ISD. I hope also that you will be spurred to enact policies that hold the superintendent accountable for measures that will increase support for teachers, families, and students. For far too long, the kind of education a student receives has been determined by their zip code. While outstanding teachers and hardworking families create bright spots across Austin ISD, our children deserve a district blanketed with both quality and equity. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustees, are there any questions or clarifications? Trustee Singh.
So that last comment actually just gave me an idea, and I wanted to know if this is something, Dr. Elizalde, if you had heard any districts doing. Like we have all sorts of metrics and even a grade that we assign to schools based on their achievement, on student achievement. And yet, at the same time, the conversation around this is always about opportunity gaps. Like, you can't talk about achievement gaps without talking about opportunity gaps. And I'm wondering, has AISD or TEA or any educational entity considering developing some sort of opportunity score for every campus? That is, a score that would somehow be able to give somebody a sense of how many highly qualified teachers are on staff, how well their libraries are stocked, the amount of additional resources that might be coming in from PTAs or other community organizations. You know, all these, the amount of the ratio of special ed, teachers to students. I mean, just like something to help quantify the opportunities. I feel like we have no sense of that unless we look campus by campus, and that's the conversation that I would love for us to start having more.
So I think those are the types of discoveries that we want to bring forward. I would still, I know this will not be the answer that people want to hear, but in keeping with, that's an input.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the input, and so you don't put inputs in a scorecard. But that doesn't mean you don't look at the inputs, and it doesn't mean, because in fact, we have to begin to quantify, are these inputs that we're utilizing, are they giving us the outcomes that we're looking for? So that if they're not, then I would be coming back to the board and saying, well, we're gonna need to add, I don't know, we need to make a budget amendment, and I need to do this or that or the other based on the data, and then bring that forward so that we would make adjustments based on what we're seeing. So I think it's completely on target, and it should be the things that you should expect from us to bring forward. I just want to reiterate, that those are the conversations. We have to be able to link them to those outputs and ultimately the outcomes. But I think they're spot on with regard to how do we begin to move the outcomes. It is in fact in the inputs that we're utilizing, without a
Correct.
doubt.
Yeah, and I think, and I wasn't suggesting we put that in the scorecard, but I think it is something that would be super helpful for our school communities, for example, to be able to compare across campuses, like, how are we doing with regards to other campuses in terms of the inputs, so that they can ask the questions and advocate, and it also helps us make a case for our advocacy efforts as well. If, so I do hope that, I look forward to, I know y'all are on it, but I
just wanted to mention, because there is one report that we do have to complete, which is a comparability report. And that's a report that, in which we have to demonstrate that campuses that need more are in fact getting more, and that campuses, for instance, Title I campuses, you have to have a certain amount of investment. And I believe our chief business officer may be able to add just a little bit more color to my overgeneralization. But the state, just because you asked, are there anything? I don't think it's sufficient, but I do want, and we should be bringing you those comparability reports so that you can see where some campuses, we have to meet more input into campuses. Now, whether they're the right inputs is on us, but we definitely need to make sure we're doing that. Mr. Throm, do you have anything to add with regard to comparability, just to shed a little bit of light of what that is, sir?
Comparability reports are required by the federal government in order for us to continue receiving Title I funds. And they're broken down by elementary, middle school, and high school, and it measures the amount of money spent per student. The government does not want to see inequity and does not want to even see unequalness in the expenditure of funds. And so this report then measures the amount of expenditures per student across those three categories, and you can be over or you can be under. And I haven't done it in a couple of years, but I believe it's 10%. You can be 10% over the average or 10% under. And if you're over, you have to decrease your expenditures. They won't let you spend more money than 10% more than the middle. And if you're under, well, then you need to put more money in. And the money we're talking about here is only the general fund. The government is they're thinking that you need to take your local money and split it equally. Then they're going to give you the Title I, the special ed, the Title II, the Title III, the Title IV, the Title VI. There's some vocational money out there. They'll put that on top of it, but it's not going to go to every school equally. And that's where and it's measured by the number of students on free and reduced lunches, the ECODIS percentage. And if your ECODIS is very high, you're going to get a lot of federal money. If it's very low, you're going to get zero of federal money, and you have to make it on the general fund.
Thank you, Mr. Throm. So I think when we see that we're utilizing monies there, but then it comes to the question that I think you asked Trustee Singh about, well, where are we lowering student to teacher ratios? Do we have did we add a social worker? Do we have, many years ago before, and I think it was the federal government, we actually used to have special counselors for drug and substance abuse. Those were prevalent throughout all of our schools in Texas, I would say about a decade ago. And just a superficial look at it is when that left, I tended, wherever I was working, to see an increase in substance abuse. So that might be something, for instance, that title money could be used for. But if we're not doing needs assessment, in other words, if we're just saying, okay, elementary school, here's your money, and we're not doing an analysis of what it is the campus needs, then we may not be utilizing those resources in the most meaningful way. And so I think we're all saying exactly the same thing, and we will meet your expectations and provide that to you. Thank you, Mr. Throm.
Trustee Zapata?
So, back when my kids were in elementary, Title I paid 100% for the parent support specialist. I don't know when it went to halftime or why it went halftime, but the parent support specialist is, especially now, such a key role to student success, because we need that parent support specialist to help parents know how to help their kids navigate the homework, how to do training sessions, everything to help the parents support the student at home. So it's always on the cutting board with the city, because it's funded half city and half AISD. So, I mean, that's one position that should just be a general budget item, if however we can do it, because we should not be waiting to see if the city's going to give their part or not. But it's a key role for student success in every form, in building school community, all of it. And, you know, so I just wanted to share that. And I don't know why it's now part-time. So some parent support specialists were working at 2 schools part-time, and that's just unrealistic to build parent relationships and to do really quality parent trainings. So I just wanted to share that.
I certainly hear you. We're working on all of that. I just want to make sure everybody also keeps in mind that there are a certain amount of dollars, and then there's a certain amount of analysis of the data, and then there's a certain amount of autonomy that's provided to a campus as well. And so sometimes when we look at one item in isolation, we may have to pull back out and find out why did that happen and where else is the money going before I immediately say whether we should or shouldn't do that. And so I think all of this is very important for our conversations as we build these campus improvement plans, as we look at these taper reports, and all of the questions and comments that I've heard this evening are going to be very helpful as we're working with campuses and we start asking the questions. As I find out the history, how did we go from 100% to 50%? How did we end up expending then the rest of the money? Was there something else that was added? Are we getting benefit from whatever else was added, so that we can continue, I think, to make decisions? I'm going to use the word ecosystem, because I think sometimes we're looking at something and not recognizing it has an impact on several things in the entire organization. So we'll continue to take note of all of the comments, and thank you so much for all of the comments and the questions, and we'll continue to utilize those as we're in our planning sessions.
So trustees, any other questions? Okay, if not, at this time, we will adjourn our public hearing, take a short break, and then return to open the regular voting meeting. Secretary Singh, do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Is there a second? Is that Trustee Zapata? Having a motion by Secretary Singh and a second by Trustee Zapata to adjourn, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. And the motion passes by all those on the dais. This meeting is adjourned at 6:39 p.m. and we will open our regular meeting in a few minutes. Thank you. Good evening. In compliance with Chapter 551 Open Meetings of the Texas Government Code, I call to order a regular voting meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Austin Independent School District for Monday, January 25th, 2021 at 6:48 p.m. A quorum of the board, along with a limited number of our staff members, are physically present at AISD Central Office to conduct this meeting. In addition, we have a majority of our staff joining us by video. To our audience tuning in remotely, welcome and thank you again for joining us. We will move to the approval of the agenda. Secretary Singh, do you have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Having a motion by Secretary Singh and a second by Trustee Anderson to approve the agenda, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. And the motion passes by all those on the dais. Secretary Singh, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance and the pledge to the Texas flag?
Por lealtad a la bandera de los Estados Unidos de América y a la república que representa una nación bajo Dios indivisible, con libertad y justicia para todos. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Honro a la bandera de Texas, te juro lealtad, Texas, un estado bajo Dios, único e indivisible.
Trustees, we will now move to our Game Changers items, which is our opportunity to recognize and observe important items happening in AISD and our nation. Dr. Elizalde, would you please introduce our first item?
Yes, sir. Thank you, President Rodriguez. Members of the board. I want to make sure I'm in the right order. Okay, I'm missing my. One moment, please. Here we are. Trustees, showing appreciation for the important work of school boards should be a year-round process, but too often we neglect to recognize you, the dedication of all of you who represent us. This January, our district is asking all members of our community, if you can, please take a moment and thank a school board member. Thank you to all of these individuals, to the men and women at this dais who dedicate, trust me, countless personal hours to ensure the needs of our community and that they are met so that our public schools succeed. We salute the public servants of Austin ISD whose dedication and civic responsibility make local control of public schools in our community possible. We applaud them for their vision and voice to prepare today's students to be tomorrow's leaders. Our school board members are volunteers. Let me repeat that. They are volunteers who shoulder critical responsibilities and often have to make difficult choices for our district. Each member serves as a link between the community and the classroom. They are elected to establish the policies that provide the framework for our public schools. The Austin ISD's board is responsible for an annual budget of $1.6 billion, just under 75,000 students currently, slightly more than 11,000 employees, and just over 110 schools. Board members serving Austin ISD include our president, Jeronimo Rodriguez Jr., District 6, Vice President Yasmin Wagner, District 7, Secretary Arti Singh, at-large Position 9, Leticia Anderson, District 1, Ofelia Maldonado Zapata, District 2, Kevin Foster, District 3. Kristen Ashe, District 4. Lynn Boswell, District 5. And Noelita Lugo, at large, Position 8. We are thankful for you every day. Thank you for the heart you pour into your tireless efforts for the children of Austin who are entrusted to our care. And as Margaret Mead said, never ever doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you, board members.
Thank you, Dr. Elizalde. And thank you to my fellow board members for your commitment and dedication to our mission to prepare every student with the knowledge and skills to thrive in college, career, and life. I also just want to say thank you. There was what do we, I don't know what to call this, a basket?
A basket of goodies
goods.
that several of our schools put together for you as our trustees. So we want you to enjoy that. You can see that many of our schools prepared posters and signage for you. We want you to know how much you are loved and admired by our school community.
Thank you again for all of that recognition. Our next item is a recognition of one of our partner organizations. Dr. Elizalde.
Yes, and I'm going to turn this over to our Executive Director, Michelle Wallace. Michelle?
Good evening, trustees. My name is Michelle Wallace, Executive Director of the Office of Innovation and Development and the Austin Ed Fund. Nice to be with you this evening, and thank you for your service. President Rodriguez, trustees, and Dr. Elizalde, I'm here tonight to ask for formal recognition of one of our partners, Austin Freenet. This year's pandemic forced us to reimagine how we provide equitable access to all students while learning remotely. We could not have done this without so many community partners. Tonight, we're excited to recognize our special partnership with Austin Freenet, who stepped up its support this year by coordinating technology distribution in order to help close the digital divide across the district. Special thanks to our friends from Austin Freenet who are watching tonight. Sky Downing, Executive Director, Kevin Enders, who's the board president, and 3 board members, John Sermon, Dr. Sharon Strover, and Bernard Benson. Now it is my honor to request formal recognition, trustees, for Austin Freenet.
Thank you, Michelle. Trustee Singh, could you please read the recognition statement?
Happy to. On behalf of the Austin ISD Board of Trustees, it is my honor to recognize Austin Freenet for their support and commitment to Austin ISD students, staff, and families. When the news of COVID-19 reached us here in Central Texas last March and forced AISD to close its doors to do in-person learning, the district had to reimagine how to best provide an equitable education for all students remotely. With an opportunity this large, we couldn't do it alone, and from the very beginning of the pandemic, generous neighbors from across the Austin community rallied together with offers of financial support and in-kind donations to impact students and families in need. Austin Freenet has been a vital partner in accepting in-kind technology donations on behalf of AISD. Since the pandemic began, Austin Freenet has received over 330 technology device donations that they sanitized, re-imaged, and distributed to AISD families. Through numerous drive-through distribution events and home deliveries, Austin Freenet provided technology devices such as laptops and desktop computers to families across Austin. When AISD needed them the most, Austin Freenet helped fill the technology gap, most notably seen with our pre-K through 2 grade students during remote learning. And to close out 2020, Austin Freenet coordinated the distribution of devices to 84 AISD parents who were enrolled in the Pathway to Paraeducator certification program that provides parents with the opportunity to earn a certification to work as a teaching assistant. These types of partnerships are to be commended, and it is with great pride that the Board of Trustees of the Austin Independent School District recognizes and thanks Austin Freenet for their partnership in support of AISD students and families. And if I may, on a personal note, it's so fitting and such a coincidence that I got to read this because back in the 90s, I actually was a volunteer at an Austin Freenet community telecenter, I think it was on Comal Avenue, with Dr. Gary Chapman from the LBJ School, who helped set that up. And he has passed, but I'm just so thrilled to see that this organization has continued to grow and serve our communities in many amazing ways. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Trustee Singh. Dr. Elizalde, could you provide our next recognition?
Actually, the next three recognitions have a very common theme. I think all of them circle around the word justice. So I'll begin with our Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. recognition. Although Dr. King's work started decades earlier, and we celebrated Dr. King Monday, January 18th, yet we have never been so viscerally reminded, particularly in this last year, that the struggle did not end in the 1960s. It continues to this very day. If you will bear with me, I would like to set a situation. Suppose we were given the task of swimming from one side of a pool to the other. Let's assume that we knew how to swim. We're willing and eager to get started. As we slip into the water, we're told, oh, one more thing. You need to carry this special pack of 100 pounds of weights. Suddenly, our eagerness turns to despair. This might feel similar to something called prejudice. It can take a person like us with normal abilities, with an opportunity to contribute to life and live that life with dignity, and weigh us down with such penalties that just making it through becomes a Herculean task. Therein lies the inherent danger of prejudice. It keeps people from becoming all they can be. If because of prejudice, a potential doctor never graduates from medical school, the world has lost. If because of prejudice, a potential engineer does not go to school, the bridges of the future may never be built. If because of prejudice, a teacher or a scholar or an artist remains only a potential, the world is less. You see, we all lose. We all suffer. To me, that is the truth that became evident to a man of peace and vision named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Here was a man who had firsthand knowledge of the horrors that could be wrought by prejudice. He saw the suffering and limitations placed upon a people by virtue of nothing more than the color of their skin. If anyone had a reason to hate, it was him. He was, however, a man of God and a man of peace who chose to fight prejudice and hate with the most devastating weapon of all, love. With love as his guide, he fought for justice with a fervor and conviction that comes from the knowledge that your cause is just, and that with perseverance, hate can be overcome. Although his life ended in an act of hate, crushed by an assassin's bullet, the love he taught by the example of his life continued after him and continues through this very day. It is a love for all mankind, unhindered by race or creed. It is a love that realizes that every person's freedom is a part of our individual freedoms, and, as he said and wrote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. His was a love for freedom that places him in the ranks of the greatest of Americans. His was a love that teaches us to care for the members of our family, the family not of the white race or the black race, but that of the human race. His was a love that inspires us to be the best of which we are capable of becoming in every way. Therefore, let us honor this special man by keeping the precepts of love foremost in our lives, both on his special day and throughout the days of our lives. For us as leaders of this district, this means acknowledging that our school systems are not exempt from the perpetuation of inequities, and that dismantling inequities requires intentional action. It means having honest, though compassionate, conversations about what is happening now, the injustices that have brought us here, and the steps we will take to disrupt inequitable practices that keep us from moving out of this place. This is the work we expressly are committed to doing in Austin ISD. It is going to take all of us to lovingly and graciously hold each other accountable in order for us to succeed in this work. This is our work, the work we have chosen as educators, and I want to reaffirm our commitment to putting the work towards equity in our school system at the forefront of our decisions and our actions. So in the words of Amanda Gorman, there is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it.
Trustees, is there anything else, anything you'd like to share regarding the Martin Luther King recognition? Trustee Anderson?
First of all, thank you for that. I mean, it really speaks to, and I don't want to say the day, because Martin Luther King was Martin Luther King every day. So thank you for that, and I'm looking forward to the progress we make, and thank you.
Trustees, any other? Dr. Elizalde, thank you for those words. I think one of the things, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize Carol Wright and all of the volunteers of the Austin Heritage Council that every single year, without recognition, ensure that our community recognizes Martin Luther King Day. And so I know Carol's one of our employees, but also does this effort. So I just wanted to make sure that we recognized her and the hundreds of volunteers that help with those efforts. Next, we're going to have one more recognition, no, three more recognitions. Dr. Elizalde, you want to provide the next one?
President Rodriguez, members of the board, I want to take this moment as a point of privilege, as my husband is Richard Lewins, who is a descendant of Jewish ancestry. Their original last name was Lewinsky, and so it is with pride that I take this moment to recognize Holocaust Remembrance Week. So I put my cross away. We honor the memory of the millions of individuals, the mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, friends and neighbors, who lost their lives during a time of unparalleled depravity and inhumanity. We also honor those who survived the Holocaust, many of them spared from death because of righteous individuals who risked their own lives to save Jews and other victims from Nazi persecution. The stories of these survivors and their protectors remind us to confront persecution wherever it arises, and that silence can actually be an accomplice to evil. They remind us of our duty to counter the rising tide of anti-Semitism, bigotry, hatred that threatens the values we hold dear of pluralism, diversity, and the freedoms of religion and expression. This is a time for us all to call upon all people of goodwill to be vigilant and vocal against every form of bigotry. When we recognize our interconnectedness and the fundamental dignity and equality of every human being, we help to build a world that is more accepting, secure, and free. This is the best way to honor the legacy and to fulfill our responsibilities to repair our world from generation to generation. As public educators, we reaffirm our ongoing responsibility to work with our students to study the Holocaust within today's context, to live out the admonition, never forget, never again. President Rodriguez, I think you also have a few comments.
Thank you, Dr. Lizalde. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our partner, our AISD partner, the Austin Area Anti-Defamation League, or ADL. The ADL was instrumental in working with the state for the implementation of Holocaust Remembrance Week. And today marks the start of the second annual observation, which will run through the end of the week. In addition to the work of ADL and other state leaders in ensuring students have lessons and age-appropriate materials to discuss this complex issue, the ADL also provides Austin ISD with the No Place for Hate effort. Austin is proud to be the largest No Place for Hate school district, which means that all of our schools and all our central office complete yearly the No Place for Hate discussions and group projects. Dr. Elizalde, could you please share our next recognition?
This next recognition is something that I actually learned about in preparing. Fred Korematsu Day. Fred Korematsu did not set out to become a civil rights hero, as most heroes do. But his bold decision at the age of 23 to challenge the policy of Japanese internment forever altered the course of history. We reflect with gratitude on his brave crusade for civil rights. An Oakland-born welder, Korematsu refused to abide by the Executive Order 9066. That's the federal government's demand that Japanese Americans, for no reason other than being Japanese Americans, report to incarceration camps. Korematsu's act of protest led to his arrest and conviction, which he fought all the way to the Supreme Court. And that court initially ruled against him, arguing that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was in fact justifiable. Korematsu found vindication 40 years later when a federal court overturned his criminal conviction. Judge Marilyn Hill Patel said then, "A grave injustice was done to American citizens and resident aliens of Japanese ancestry who, without individual review or any probative evidence against them, were excluded, removed, and detained by the United States during World War II." Over the course of his life, Korematsu fought for the civil liberties of others. He was tireless in his work to ensure Americans understood the lessons learned from one of the dark chapters of our history. And in fact, in 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded Korematsu the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Korematsu's legacy reminds us that we must continue to strike out against injustice in our daily lives. Over the coming weeks, AISD scholars will learn about this lesser known, but no less important hero of the civil rights movement. Korematsu exemplifies dignity and persistence in the face of injustice. We humbly take this moment to express our gratitude for the contributions of Korematsu and the other unsung heroes who have contributed to this rich multiculturalism that makes Austin such a special place to live. Their work insists that we not forget this painful past and leaves us with collective hope for a more peaceful future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elizalde. Trustees, any thoughts or comments to share? So we have one more recognition. Next, the board would like to pay tribute to a longtime journalist, mother, teacher, and student advocate, Sarah Lively, who passed away earlier this month. Mrs. Lively spent her educational career at what was then Fulmore Middle School, both as a teacher and also a volunteer after retiring. She continued to go to the school. Mrs. Lively had a passion for journalism and a deep commitment of care for every student she met. And it was pretty evident when on December of 2018, this board voted to rename Fulmore Middle School after Miss Lively. We were honored to have her and her family and many of the students that she taught in attendance during the historic vote. And if you will allow me, I would now like to read the proclamation statement for Lively Middle School, which is in District 6. Whereas the Austin community lost one of its greatest educators with the passing of Sarah Beth Lively, January 4th, 2021, at the age of 88. And whereas the Board of Trustees of the Austin Independent School District wishes to honor the memory of Mrs. Sarah Beth Lively for her service to the youth and families of Austin. And whereas Mrs. Lively worked in the Austin Independent School District for 25 years as a dedicated and inspiring social studies teacher at Fulmore Middle School, who spent decades as a mentor and sponsor to student journalists, and whereas after completing 25 years as a devoted professional to the Austin Independent School District, Mrs. Lively continued her work as a volunteer for another 25 years. And whereas the Austin Independent School District was proud to honor Mrs. Lively by renaming Fulmore in her honor, now therefore be it resolved that the Austin Independent School District Board of Trustees hereby supports this proclamation as a lasting tribute for Mrs. Sarah Beth Lively for her 50 years of service to the Austin Independent School District community, its students and families, and for her many contributions that touch so many lives in such positive and meaningful ways. And this proclamation is presented publicly to her family by the Board of Trustees, approved on the 25th day of January 2021. And trustees, that concludes the number of recognitions. We had quite a few tonight, but I just wanted to again ask if there was any comments or thoughts before we move to the next item. Trustee Zapata.
Oh, thank you for sharing those recognitions. I learned a lot tonight. And, I participated in an equity and justice conference today with the TASA. And what they reminded me is, me growing up, I didn't know much about what was going on around me. I didn't even know about the wars until I went to ACC myself, 25 years after I graduated. So because being visually impaired, I just was not in tune with so much. But today, our students from elementary age, 3-year-olds, 4 years, 5 years, now with their tablets, they're getting taught by the world, social media. So there's unlimited, not good information that they are being developed. Their characters are being developed through social media. So what the speakers were saying was, teachers, it's time to have these conversations with students, to have them share the recording of what you said tonight, to have them reflect and just speak to their own. Let them speak freely, to understand that to agree to it's okay to agree to disagree and respect each other, but we have to have those conversations, because in the schools I've been in my district, there is so much hate, so much bullying, so much anger, so much violence. And so, because nobody's talking, nobody's sharing. So I really hope that our schools, educators, really use what you shared tonight to have those conversations, not just this week, but make time every day to talk about it. So these kids have a place, a platform where they can share their feelings and to be able to really give their whole self to learning, because there's a lot in their minds that is distracting them. And so I just want to thank you again for sharing those recognitions tonight.
Thank you, Trustee Zapata. Trustees, any other comments? Well, thank you again. The next item on our agenda is under the President's Report. This Saturday, the board held their first retreat as a new team. During this retreat, we worked with an outside facilitator from the Council of Great City Schools, which is a coalition of superintendents and trustees from the nation's 76 largest urban districts. As a team, we discussed the norms, expectations, and systems for trustees. This conversation focused on our expectations for governance and our collective vision and values for the district. The time allowed us to introspectively share our thoughts on governance and, more importantly, express our personal why of what led us to pursue service for the Austin ISD Board of Trustees. Together, we discussed commitments we can make to each other and the community to ensure we have transparent and productive meetings that always remain focused on our values. The board discussed how we will schedule items, how we will ensure these items are aligned to our priorities and to improving student outcomes, and how we will communicate this work to the community. There was a clear common goal for everyone at the retreat. We must put our time, resources, and focus on improving outcomes of students, for our students. I'd like to thank my colleagues for dedicating their time on a Saturday to our commitment of continuous learning for everyone in the district, including the board. As a team of 10, we are responsible for reflecting the values of the community and ensuring a shared vision for every single AISD student. This meeting was the first of many in our journey of holding ourselves, our community, and the superintendent accountable for the joint responsibility of creating inclusive learning environments, high expectations, and most importantly, high outcomes for every student. Our next item is the superintendent's report and information on our Open for Learning plan. Dr. Elizalde.
Thank you, President Rodriguez, members of the board. I too learned so much from our Saturday time together, and I hope that my report begins to reflect some of the things that I have learned since this time, just a few hours ago, actually, when you think about it. So if I could please have our PowerPoint. Thank you. Next slide, please. So as we begin moving forward, I will work to be concise regarding certain data aspects with regard to our current situation, but always keeping an eye on what the future brings for us and what student outcomes are connected to our items for discussion. Because this is a very important period of time during the COVID crisis, I did want to bring forth information that I think the board would find helpful. In summary, the last day of face-to-face student reporting prior to my requesting and encouraging families that were able to see if they could reduce the number of students on campus, you can see that we went from district-wide 22% to, after asking our families to see if possible to support fewer students on campus, we ended up with 7%. As Dr. Escott had requested, this would allow us 2 weeks where we would have reduced the number of individuals on our campuses. We also provided flexible staffing on campus and at central facilities. As of today, in comparison, as we have now begun a cautious approach to the 22%, today, for the board's information, we were at 18% face-to-face reporting. 11,447 students at the elementary. Remember that that is divided up amongst 78 campuses. 1,452 middle school students divided amongst 18 schools. And 687 high school students. combined for an 18% reporting. In visiting with Dr. Escott today, next slide, please. COVID cases in our community, which is not represented on this slide. This is Austin ISD slide, but some context. COVID cases in our community, in our greater community, have decreased for 5 consecutive days. Hospitalizations have decreased for 6 consecutive days. ICUs admissions have been decreasing for 9 consecutive days. The GA32, which is the governor's executive order of the 15% threshold of hospitalizations being attributed to COVID. Austin and Travis County was one of the last areas to actually hit that number. We will probably be, based on Dr. Escott and UT Dell Medical School's modeling, we will probably be one of the first communities to be able to exit that concerning number. So he's continuing to ask from the Austin Public Health that if individuals can stay at home, that we continue to do that, but there is light on the horizon. Contextually, I wanted to provide to you Austin ISD. This is, of course, available on our COVID dashboard, but I think it is very important to note that you can see we've had 2 weeks now of declining cases. We had an all-time high, exactly as was predicted, right, following the winter break, of 183 COVID cases, reduced to 131 and down to 93. So we are now below the previous high of 96. And again, in visiting with Dr. Escott, because Austin ISD has such a low percentage of face-to-face students, he did think that it was okay for us to continue opening cautiously as we have done. Next slide, please. And so where do we go from here? As in learning from our retreat, we want to continue to stay focused on the board's priority focus areas. Student well-being and achievement, always with equity. Teacher and employee well-being, always with equity. Culture of respect, customer service, always with equity. And of course, fiscal stewardship and prioritization, always with the lens of equity. So what does that mean? Next slide, please. As we begin, by no coincidence, all of the items and the questions that were asked by you trustees in alignment with our taper report, that disaggregation will generate our strategic plan. Currently, we see about 4 areas that could be our key priorities. We know we will need to accelerate academic achievement and equity. I'd like to discuss this for just a couple of minutes. Why field trips? I think it's really important to have just an opening comment here. In many instances, when you look at disparities in groups of students, this is the first thing that traditional campuses, traditional leadership remove. We go to an old, if you will, traditional concept of take away recess, take away field trips, take away. Those are the very things that are part of not just mental health, which is critical and vital to success, as we all know, but it is also context. I was thinking just yesterday as I was watching a couple of the football games on Sunday, how did I learn the vocabulary of the football game? My father had no boys, so I had to sit with him and watch football games. How did I learn what the offensive line was? How did I learn that they were running a 5-4 defense? How did I learn that that was going to be a deep pass? How did I learn those things? He didn't have me sit down and write down the definitions of those words. It was contextual, or what we might call today relevant. We really must focus on challenging. See, our kids know when we're giving them hard stuff, and they want the hard stuff, but they want it to have meaning. So rigor, relevance, and never forgetting those relationships. It is those relationships. Field trips are about the relationships that our children form as they have these experiences, whether it's a play or orchestra or a movie or museums. Austin has such a rich environment for which we can connect field trips directly to our curriculum. So this will be an area of focus as we continue to disaggregate the data. And I use this because this has to be the core of our teaching and learning. The way we no longer worry about STAR or any other assessment that the state puts in our midst is by having authentic teaching and learning, where kids love learning, the joy of learning. Then whatever assessment is put in their path is not the outcome. And in fact, I would encourage us to focus on the process and not the outcome. We need to provide very prescriptive, intensive interventions. There's a report, and Dr. Foster may know it, many of you may know it, called the Nintendo effect. There was a study done in asking students, why do you stay on a computer game even though you fail, but you do it again? Why do you do that? Well, after a couple of years of study, what they found was that kids said two things. One was, I get to do it again. I get a do-over. And I already know where I went, and I get to go to another level. They weren't dissuaded by having to go through all of the places they had been before in a video game. But because they got to start over, which really goes to what we call mastery learning. Does it matter when I learn it? Or is it just important that I learn the concept? So we need to really, particularly our schools where our students may be struggling, recognize that their struggle is a result of us not meeting their needs. There's nothing wrong with our students. There's nothing wrong with our teachers. What we need to do is provide the type of support and training that is necessary. So we need to design summer school to truly be able to capture the hearts and minds of our students. This should be something students should want to do. We know early childhood education and equity are a really cornerstone of a successful school system. We need to expand that enrollment. I know this probably won't surprise you, but we need to build an enrollment office in our district. We need to have a process where students of all grade levels understand and that it be something that is user-friendly. But early childhood is a place in which we can begin immediately. We need to definitely increase our kindergarten and pre-kindergarten readiness, and we really need to start getting the voices of our teachers, of our parents, on what they think is or isn't working in those programs, a place for their voice. Lastly, we want to start talking about crib to college. When they're born, let's send them a little onesie. Austin ISD, class of, I can't add that number because who knows how old I'm going to be by that time, but imagine if we begin to have touch points. Several of you have made several suggestions. Trustee Boswell was talking about, well, why not have days at school where families, you don't have to be a student, you just live in the community and there's a read-in day or a playground day. Now, right now, we know that we've been hindered by COVID, but that will not last forever, and we need to start planning and we need to start capturing our parents so that they know what we have to offer as they're choosing other public, other private, and other charter schools. The time is now. College, career, tech ed, completion, and equity. Absolutely need to ensure that our career academies, that we are funding them in the way that are necessary for our students to be able to reach those certifications. Austin Community College is poised and ready to partner with us. We've had several meetings and we see many opportunities. Of course, we want to increase the number of students getting their associate's degree in early college high schools before they leave high school, and our PTECs with industry partners where there can be entry-level jobs and mentorships and internships. We can expand all of the CTE pathways. And of course, how can we increase college enrollment across the board? Lastly, we need to have access for all. So those opportunities need to be available, whether it's dual language, STEM or STEAM, single gender, personalized learning. We have a unique opportunity in what we have learned from COVID and virtual instruction. We don't want to lose those lessons. They're things that we can then utilize to improve our school environments. We need to ensure that we are truly embedding social emotional learning, creative learning initiative, and that our special education truly becomes a cornerstone of you are a general ed student and you are a special ed student. This is something over and above. It does not replace all of the access that our students should have in general ed just because you're special education. In fact, you should get more. This is just an initial listing. Our team will continue to have conversations and dive into the data. But after reflecting on our retreat, and after, in this particular case, getting a strong nudge from Trustee Boswell of what does the future look like? How do we communicate that out? Really got me thinking and our team thinking. So this is just an initial pass at what we will be working on collectively to bring you shortly. As for the future, the next slide, we also know that this is the time of year a little behind. Nonetheless, campuses that will be closed to transfers. We want to make sure we are communicating with our communities about which campuses those are. These are not new campuses, but we have reviewed and revisited. So our high schools will include, of course, Aikens and Bowie. Middle schools, I'm not even going to attempt. I still need to work on my pronunciation. That one. Lamar, Lively. Elementary schools, Baranoff, Cowan, Kiker. Starting tomorrow is when our transfer period can begin. And so with that, I wanted to make a slight different approach to our data, be it that this is at a very high level, but the beginnings of what the 21-22 school year can begin to take shape. And I always want us to remind ourselves, equity is the cornerstone of all of the framework which you all have agreed to and in fact want to see in the center. And excellence is also the outcome that you want for all of our students. So we'll continue to work towards excellence and equity in education for each and every student. And with that, I'd be happy to take some questions, comments.
Thank you, Dr. Elizalde. Trustee Anderson?
Thank you for the presentation, and you got me super excited over here. I just wanted to say, as you talked about field trips and reading, as I'm looking at this reading and math skills accelerating, you know, one thing that I have always said is, how can I, if I were a young student in elementary, be exposed to anything outside of my home if field trips are non-existent? And so I love it. And for the reading, I would just say, please think out of the box. There are so many ways a student can pick up those high frequency words with reading. You have tons of kids that are into, you know, computers. You know, you have video games that you can learn so many high frequency words, because that's how I do my child. And I'm just excited about so much of this, so thank you.
Trustees, any? Trustee Singh?
Thank you so much for this presentation, Dr. Elizalde. I was wondering if you could also give us a little bit more of an update on the scorecard for this school year and how that's being impacted by the pandemic, and what measures we might be looking at. Is it going to be next month that we are talking about that?
Yes, ma'am. We'll be bringing the scorecard back in February. I believe that board has already approved the scorecard for the
Yes.
2021 school year. And so there are lists of data points that won't be available, and then there are lists of data points that are available. I can certainly get that to you.
Okay, great. Is that something we might be able to discuss at the board information session?
I don't
as
see
well?
why not.
Okay, that'll be great. Thank you. I also was interested, so speaking of that, there are some things that are on our approved scorecard so y'all know that we approved this year's scorecard before the pandemic hit. So obviously there is, that's why I asked the question. There's some additional things that I personally would be interested in, so I'm just going to throw that out there, if that's something that y'all might be able to consider gathering. One of them is, I'm really curious to know what percentage of our students are regularly logging into Blend, because that kind of gives us some indication as to who still has internet access and who doesn't at home. Would love to see that by subgroup if that's possible.
By student group?
Yes, by student group, yes. Another thing that has come up a couple of times today is special education evaluations. Understanding that there had to, there was a pause because we had no choice, but I would like to get a sense of what that backlog actually looks like. And also curious to know the percent of teacher vacancies, particularly by Title I versus non-Title I schools, because that has been a chronic issue in our district. And so I'd love to get a sense of how this pandemic is, affecting that. Also interested in, I'm just giving you the whole shebang, so you might not be able to get half of these, and that's fine, but I'm just putting it out there. Attendance information by student group.
Trustee Singh, could I ask you, could these be that we put those in the tracker so that I could just prepare a report for everybody?
Yeah, that would be great. That would
Okay.
be excellent. And the last one.
I'm just trying to write them all down. So
Oh, yeah,
that's-
I'll definitely send this.
Okay.
And the last one is FAFSA completion. That's something that I know that we're going to have to track anyway because of the new
Yes, ma'am.
law, but just wanting to see how the pandemic might be impacting that as well. Thank you, and I will certainly submit that. The other thing I wanted to ask about was just kind of follow up to something I had brought up previously. I remember one of the things that you've said to us several times, which I love and believe as well, is that the teacher is the program. And I would love to be able to see an updated chart showing what, how many of our teachers have resigned, have retired early, are on family medical leave, and that type of thing, because I don't think we've gotten that update recently, and I think at the last board meeting, I had requested that to be made public. So do you have an update on when we might be able to see that?
My apologies, because I know we put one together and I thought we had sent that out. I can make that a part of a board update at least once a month when we get that information. I'll be happy to send that out.
Okay, that's great. And is that something that could also be made available to the public as well?
Of course.
Great, thank you. And this is kind of just like a general question, but what, if anything, is the district doing right now to retain its most qualified staff during the pandemic?
Well, I think we're continuing to offer as much flexibility as we can. I also think we're working on providing access to additional support services and continuing to gather the data. I think we're working with hospital providers to accelerate teachers with underlying health conditions or 65 or older having access to the vaccines. We've given approximately right over 1,500 to our neediest, not just teachers, but any staff members. That's because I think it's something we want to retain as many of our staff, right, all staff as possible. And then there are a couple of other items that we'll be looking at that we'll be bringing you at a later time.
Okay, I appreciate that. Do you, along those lines, do we have a sense of so I have heard anecdotally, it is hard to hire substitute teachers right now. And I recognize, I imagine all districts have that problem. Do we have a sense of how many of our students are in a situation where they don't have, where we don't have a long-term sub or a sub if a teacher has left? And also, I don't know, are we doubling up classrooms in some instances, or sending kids to a cafeteria, let's say, and doing asynchronous learning? I'm just curious to know, like, how students are being served when they don't have a teacher.
So we probably have, like, we have 108 schools. I probably have 108 different versions, and probably each of those principals will give me additional versions. But I think we have Leslie Stevens, who might be able to help us with some of that data, at least anecdotally, while we gather that for you, Trustee Singh, and then we'll put it together and submit it so all the trustees can see that information with regard to substitutes.
Okay.
Ms. Stevens, do you have something you could add that would help this conversation?
So some of the information that I know of is in the fall, when we had teachers out on accommodations, we had central office staff that were going out to campuses and were assigned to campuses to assist in those situations. Starting January, they did report back to central office, so we are relying on our substitutes. But we also, with the low percentage of students on campuses, they have done some switching of students in classes. So it could be that, if you were assigned to one teacher and they aren't present on campus, they are there with a teacher that is on campus. Last week was kind of difficult because we were encouraging people to stay home. And so they did do some, free, flexible staffing. So at this point, it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what students and what teachers, because it varies to this point. But we can get you the numbers of substitutes. We have about 700 in our pool.
Thank you. I think, and I'm not sure exactly what data would show this, but I'm trying to get a sense of how many of our students are without teachers who are certified to teach teach the subject that they're taking. And
there is.
Oh, go ahead.
there is that law that we do have to notify parents if we have a non-certified teacher in the classroom, and that's after the 30 days.
Okay, so non-certified or just non-certified in that subject area?
Non-certified.
Okay, so I think what I'm looking for, if it's not too much trouble, I don't want to I know you've got a million things to do, but that is one thing that helps us understand kind of the potential impact on student learning, is what percentage of our students are now taking classes without a certified teacher in that subject. Thank you.
We can try to gather that information for you.
Thank you so much. I truly appreciate that.
We'll just need to go to each campus principal and have them give us what the circumstances are at each of those, schools, because I know they're doing that in a different way since we've allowed them to make those flexibilities. So if you'll just pull those together, and then we can provide it.
And I don't know if that's something my colleagues are interested in. If I'm the only one who wants it is a lot of work, it sounds like, to do that. So if I'm the only one, then we can discuss that. But if you're interested, okay. I just want to make sure it's not just me. Okay. Thank you.
Trustees, any other questions? Trustee Boswell and then Trustee Zapata.
I just want to say thank you, Dr. Elizalde, for pausing in the middle of, addressing the now to really share. Sorry, thank you. I want to thank you, Dr. Elizalde, for pausing in the middle of now to focus on what we need to in the immediate and for really sharing some of that vision that I think a lot of us have heard in bits and pieces. I think our community is hungry for both, and I really appreciate you putting that out and beginning to share that publicly as well. And I hope as enrollment is beginning, people are making decisions about where they will be in the fall, that campuses can share some of this long-term vision as well. I think it's exciting. It's really fantastic. And hooray for field trips. That's awesome as a learning opportunity, as really a right for students in our system. I really appreciate that it's not, it's not frivolous, that it's deeply meaningful. So thank you for that, and we have a really rich community. And thank you, too, for the enrollment office idea. And, I know a lot of us have been interested in a long-term enrollment plan. I think if you look at those strategic priorities, it hits all 4 of those. We can't take care of our finances, our teachers, our community, or our students without that. And I hope that will involve community voice. We have a lot of wisdom here for a lot of time about what has not gone well and what people would love to see to draw them back. So thank you for that. And then I just have a clarifying question about the data. Back to looking at the now. I hate to drag us back, but I think I just have a clarifying question. When we look at the Austin ISD positive graph, are those numbers of people who were actually on campus? Does it partly reflect the fact that fewer people were on campus? Kind of help me understand precisely what we're seeing so we know what to watch for as people are returning.
If a student or staff has been on campus, so it doesn't mean they were on campus, and so that Alexandra Copeland can then add to this. So anyone that has been on campus, it doesn't mean they were on campus at that time. In other words, at any time during that week, 2 weeks, usually more than 2 weeks, because our parents will sign up and then say they want to restart face-to-face or not. So we've had pretty much the same ebb and flow within a group of about 22% that have been coming. But if a student, even if they haven't shown up for a little bit, but were a part of the face-to-face, then those numbers are included in this. And so I think in isolation, we want to be sure that we weren't just looking at these numbers. Yes, we had fewer students, but remember that these cases, when you're positive, you're not going to test positive in most instances until after several days. So it means that it's a lag when we identify them as well. But collectively, with the fact that the entire community has now had decreases in all of those days, is, I think, the promising area that we're working towards. But let me have the real expert, Alexandra Copeland, directly address that question. Trustee Boswell.
Thank you.
Ms. Copeland, did you hear the question Trustee Boswell asked?
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Copeland.
Thank you, Dr. Elizalde. So we are required
You're a
to
little bit
report-
low. You're not very loud, Ms. Copeland.
Can you hear me now?
Barely.
Kind of barely.
Okay.
Is your volume all the way up?
It is on my end.
Got a little bit
see.
better there.
We can just be very quiet.
Talk loudly and we'll be quiet.
Okay, the custodians may hear me screaming down the hallway. So we are required to report on campus positives that we have. And so when we went off to break, those individuals that were in person before break that became positive over break, we were required to report that to TEA and Austin Public Health. And so the numbers that you're seeing, we saw that 183 positives right after break. A lot of those staff and students were in person before break, but a lot of them did not return after break. So many of them had close contact over break and were in quarantine, or they became symptomatic, and so we had to count them. We also had to count those individuals that may have come back that first week after break and then decided to go remote. And we do that because when we do contact tracing, we have to go back into time and look during that infectious period. So those are the ones that would be counted. Now, if we have a remote worker or learner that has been remote before break and after break that became positive, those are not counted in our dashboard numbers.
Thank you.
Does that help address that question? Okay, thank you.
Trustee Zapata.
Okay, so just to clarification, you just said you don't have the numbers that track the students that are in remote learning?
If they're remote, they haven't shown up on campus at all,
Right.
we don't count those in our cases.
Are you tracking how many students are doing remote?
Yes.
Okay.
No, they have to take attendance, whether they're face-to-face or whether they're virtual or remote, we have to take attendance. So yes, ma'am.
Okay. So these numbers we received are the ones that came in person on
Correct.
campus?
Correct.
And so where are the numbers that show the remote, the students in remote?
I'm not the number of students that are remote that have COVID, that have
No,
tested?
no, I'm sorry. This is just the numbers, so the numbers you gave are the
Yes.
numbers of students that
Coming in
had-
person. What is the
coming in
rest of the
person.
number?
Yes.
Sure, we can get you that number. It's essentially, like,
Because
when
in-
the total, for instance, is like 16,851, that's out of 74,986. So I would just subtract the 74,000, I would take the 16,851 and subtract. But we can put that in a table for you, no problem at all.
yeah.
I understand what you're asking for
Okay,
now. Yes, ma'am.
okay. All right, and then the other thing is, you mentioned campuses that are not allowing transfers, and why is that?
Because of capacity, there is no
Okay.
room at those schools. And
Okay.
we've actually reduced that number this year.
And can I just clarify here, Trustee Zapata, if I'm understanding correctly, we typically announce the frozen campuses in December, but because of the pandemic, they're announced tonight. But typically, they're done so that parents can plan for the next year 6 months ahead of time, or actually more than 6 months, but the summer and 6 months ahead of time.
So all of these campuses are meeting their numbers as the capacity for that school?
These campuses are at or actually above their building's capacity. And so only individuals who live in that attendance zone can attend that school.
Okay.
They are not open to transfers from other places in our district.
Okay,
Does that help?
yes. And the last question is on dual language. Was that, I didn't hear anything around that. And that's also a high population because, you know, we have talked about how there's some dual language schools that don't have a transfer, and I know Lively was one of the transfer places. So that's off limits, but Paderes is another one. So I'm just wondering if that's also something you're working on.
We
just
are
as an update.
realigning all of the two-way and one-way dual language or bilingual education programs so that we can ensure that individuals who start off in that program, who want to continue, that is available to them.
Okay.
So there are really three main areas that our chief academic officer is focused on. That includes the entire section of what I'll now call mental health. We need to realign, combine, ensure that we've streamlined, that those resources are accessible. The second one is special education, and the third one is bilingual or multilingual programming. Those are the three big buckets that I have assigned her and her team to really dive into, to bring together a plan of we're not gonna be able to, in 1 year, in one full swoop, like we're gonna turn this all over, right?
Right.
But you do identify what are the areas that are your biggest levers that can create the biggest change in terms of what's the change we want? Well, what's the outcome? How do we get there? So there could be only 2 or 3 things, but they could be 2 or 3 things that could really make a difference in terms of how we're providing that service and the success that our students are having. So again, my apologies for not bringing this sooner. It's taking us some time, given the COVID crisis, to really dig into the data so that we can begin to bring you the information and then our plan of action.
Okay, thank you.
Trustees, any other, Trustee Ashe?
Dr. Elzalde, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I two quick questions. Will we continue to send out the Open for Learning newsletters that we've been sending out? As the plan to continue those to answer some of the other bigger questions that some of our families may have?
Yes, ma'am. I think putting those together and having them publicly facing and available, I think will continue to be helpful, and we'll continue to do that.
Great. I did also, I know that you mentioned it, but kind of wanted to highlight it for those that may have missed that part of the meeting. Can you say again how many of our staff members have had access to the vaccine, and what that has looked like? Because I know that our teachers at one point in time had been changed in their designation as to where they fell, whether they could, at which time they could receive the vaccine. At one point, I believe they were 1B, but then I believe they have been changed to that. So I was just wondering if you could just kind of talk about that a little bit, because I really do want people to know how many of our staff have had access to the vaccine, because I think that is something that many people don't understand, how we have taken advantage of our partnerships with local medical entities to try to fast forward even and fast track some of the access to that.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that question. So teachers by the federal government were pushed into 1B regardless, but the states had the ability to change that. And our state did in fact choose not to leave educators in 1B. Therefore, teachers would have to be, or employees of school districts, private or public, would still have to be meeting the criteria of 65 or older, or under 65 with certain underlying health conditions. So starting right after Christmas, as vaccines started to come in, because of our decades of partnership with Ascension Seton, we were able to access the first about 900 vaccines. We had to turn on a dime to do that during the break. So Ms. Stevens and Human Capital Department, we all worked together. We went to our lists. We started calling 65 and older, and actually had to call, and in some instances had to register. But we were the first district that was able to provide those number of vaccines to our staff members who were, again, meeting that criteria. And many of our staff wanted the vaccine, so they could in fact feel like they didn't need to continue with some accommodations. They wanted to be back in service of students. Of course, it's a 2-vaccine system, so it still requires some time in between the first and the second, and then you still have to wait for a couple of weeks, if I'm correct, after the second one before you reach full effectiveness from the vaccine. That being said, I think there's been a total between our police department and the staffing close to 1,400 or 1,500 vaccines. That's just what we were able to work. We didn't provide the vaccine, but we provided the access through our partners. Austin Public Health is also working to see if they can provide some additional this coming week, so we're working very closely with them. Much of the information is not something we can share publicly because, as you all may have heard in the media, some of these sites start to crash when other people start to go in, and so on and so forth. So we'll have to be registering these individuals ourselves so that we can keep individuals who meet that. So I believe we're somewhere between 1,400 or 1,500. Ms. Stevens, can you correct me as to approximately how many? And those are just the ones. That doesn't include, some of our educators might have gotten the vaccine through their physician or through some other places, but these are the ones that we partnered with. Ms. Stevens?
Yes, through Ascension Seton, we did 992 in our first round. Then we worked with Community Care, and they did approximately 100. And Austin Public Health, we've done approximately 200. The police department has done theirs. We've had all of our nurses done, and we are currently working with Austin Public Health, and just provided them a list tonight. of approximately 2,000 employees that all qualify either as 1A or 1B.
That's wonderful. And I would, if others are interested too, would love to continue to receive updates on the vaccines for all of our staff in the board update, if possible. That would be wonderful. And then I also wanted to take a moment also to thank you and the school district for allowing the Performing Arts Center as well as Delco, please correct me if I'm wrong, other sites that you've made available for our community members to use for vaccine administration. Are those the only two, or were there other ones as well?
I think right now, I know we're using Delco because that is in East Austin, and that was an area that our community was very concerned that we needed to make sure we had access. And so when we heard that that was an area of concern, we immediately, both between Trustee Anderson and myself in two different meetings, actually volunteered Delco. So Delco is being used daily, and we get a report every day to make sure that we're providing them the support. Our officers are out there to help with traffic and so on. And then, as you mentioned, the Performing Arts Center has also been used. I don't know if Mr. Segura or Ms. Copeland know of any other one of our locations. I think those are the only two. We've also offered the Performing Arts Center as a place for storage for some of the hospitals in that area. Seton and others may need a place if they get large doses and they need a place to be able to store them. They have the area, but they the refrigerators, so to speak, but they don't have actual locations, and they start taking up hospital space where they're actually trying to treat patients. So any way that we can partner. Mr. Segura, are there any other locations currently that APH or Community Care or anyone else? I know you've helped with, you took the lead on getting the Performing Arts Center and Delco. Have I missed any other locations thus far?
Dr. Elzalde, no, you're indeed correct. Delco and Performing Arts Center are the two locations where we're supporting vaccination projects from various partners, ideally because of the location as well as parking opportunities. It's been a collaborative effort with our partners, and it's gone very well. We are also using, however, the warehouse, AISD warehouse, to support Ascension in managing some of their PPE that they need to kind of build up as they administer vaccines across the region. So trying to be as helpful wherever we can using the assets that we have.
Thank you. And Mr. Segura and his team have been just phenomenal of turning around as soon as they get a call that one of our city or county areas needs a facility, and have really pulled that together very quickly. So I'm really proud of our team, of our operations team, maintenance facilities, and how quickly our staff are just here to serve.
Wonderful. And I did really appreciate the forward-facing and forward-looking viewpoint that you gave in your presentation. I'm going to obviously give my little shout out to the entire early childhood education section, as that's one of my favorites. And just say, too, that I would love maybe to get as you develop that, one of the things that I would personally be interested in is to learn how the forward face looks with us increasing our own personal services and how that will work with the United Way and what we've done in that partnership. So look forward to hearing about that from you and your staff. Thank you.
Trustees, any other questions, issues, comments? I had two really quick ones. One just to follow up with Trustee Ashe. Dr. Lizalde, whether it's in a board report or in the dashboard, I was wondering if you might put on there the eligible 1A and 1B school staff for AISD so that folks know. Also, just a point of clarification, the 992 that received the vaccine at Seton and the 100 that received it at Community Care have also been scheduled for their second doses 28 days after, because they took the Moderna vaccine. So that's a promise that was made to those individuals. I don't know Austin Public Health's policy around that, but you might want to get clarification around that. I think it's important for folks to know what the total number of eligible 1A and 1B is and how many have gotten it. And I will guarantee you that this school district has gotten more right now than almost any other school district in the surrounding 5 to 10 county area. So I really appreciate your leadership and willingness of your team to be able to partner and get that done. The second issue, and really is more, Dr. Elizalde, for your efforts. I know I serve on one of the national PTA board committees, and I know we just had a resource that was put out that I thought might be helpful to you and parents in our community called pta.org/mental health, which has mental health webinars, resources, and information both in Spanish, Mandarin, and English that might be of particular interest to our community as we continue to acknowledge the trauma and the concerns that both the staff and the community and the students have. And thank you very
sir.
much for that.
We'll look into that right away.
Sure. So trustees, if there are no other questions, we're going to move to public testimony for items on consent agenda. In order to accommodate our video conference format, members of the public wishing to participate in the public testimony portion of our meeting called a dedicated AISD phone line in advance of the meeting and audio recorded their remarks. We will now play those recordings, so please listen carefully. And in the interest of transparency, I just want to mention there are 11 individuals who called in to comment on item 10.1. In the agenda, you're going to find out that, and I think you've been informed that the administration has pulled item 10.1, but out of respect for the public who took the time to make the comments, we're going to listen to them. And as I said, there's 11 of them, so I just want to make sure that folks knew that that was happening. So whenever Dan, whenever you're ready to play the comments.
Good evening, Superintendent Elizalde and members of the AIC Board of Trustees. I am Ann Teich, speaking on agenda item 10.1, the request to approve a contract for real estate consulting services that would result in the development of a comprehensive real estate strategy for the district that incorporates community input and long-term planning strategies. I strongly encourage trustees and facility staff to ensure that planning for affordable housing on suitable AISD properties be a key component of that planning. I recommend that AISD retain the land and partner with the City of Austin and other governmental bodies and with nonprofits to develop housing that would be affordable, in particular for families making less than 80% and below of median family income, and that includes many AISD staff members, so that they do not have to move outside Austin. In doing so, AISD would provide opportunities for more students to remain in our schools and aid in stopping the gentrification of certain neighborhoods. Thank you.
Hi, this is Jared Brackenridge, and I'm calling to speak on item 10.1. Basically, I just want, I basically have understood it all, basically. You are AISD, you're going to do what you're going to do and whatnot. So this does not come as a surprise for me. However, I just want to make a couple of points. I want you guys to take into consideration the affordability when you say that you want to use these properties and repurpose them. What does affordability housing look like to AISD? I think that is something that's unclear for us as a community. When you talk about staffing housing and things like that, what does that look like? What is the price point? Because not everybody has the same definition. Okay, so that's very concerning. Also, I'm a little concerned that the extensions on the contract can be approved by the superintendent at the superintendent's discretion without board approval, it looks like. Also, I'm a little concerned about how the scoring was done for the RFP. Basically, although the other candidate did get more.
Sí, buenos días. Soy Dariela Villanueva. Estoy hablando para hacer mi comentario sobre la agenda del item 10.1 sobre hacer casas accesibles en los terrenos del Distrito Escolar Independiente de Austin. Estoy a favor de que hagan casas de bajos recursos, affordable, pero tener muy en claro cuál es affordable, ¿verdad? ¿Qué cantidad es affordable para personas trabajadoras que hacen a lo mejor un ingreso anual 30,000 máximo 20,000? Entonces hay que tener mucho cuidado con la cantidad de affordable que tenemos que poner. Estoy a favor de que se realicen casas affordable houses en estas propiedades para ayudar a esta comunidad que se está desplazando a otros lugares porque está muy alto la renta de las propiedades y también el valor de las propiedades también está muy elevado. Muchas gracias y
This is an English interpretation
of Dariela Villanueva's comment. Yes, good morning. I am Dariela Villanueva, and I am calling to make my comment about agenda item 10.1, about building affordable housing in land belonging to the Austin Independent School District. I am in favor of creating low-income housing, affordable, but being very clear what is affordable, right? What amount is affordable for hardworking people that have perhaps an annual income of $30,000 or at the most $20,000. So we have to be careful with the affordable amount that we need to set. I am in favor of building houses, affordable houses, in these properties to help this community that is being displaced to other places because property value and rents are too high. Thank you very much. And
my name is Jamie Lynn Witz. I'm a Dawson Elementary parent, and I'm calling about agenda item 10.1, the contract for real estate consultant. At the very least, this should be postponed until teachers and community members are not dealing with the crisis of the pandemic. At the most, this should be changed to a district-wide committee and not a profit-maximizing service looking to sell our schools to the highest bidder. This should be discussed further in the public and with the community, teachers, parents, all involved, and not dished out to some outside agency who's going to make money off of closing our schools.
Buenos días, mi nombre es John McKenna González, padre de familia de Dawson. Estoy llamando para la agenda 10.1 y la cuestión del consentimiento y la consultoría para los bienes y raíces de Austin ISD. Primero, que se le dé prioridad para vivienda pública para la gente que vive cerca de Anita Coy, para que la gente pueda vivir aquí en Austin. Segundo, que se le dé prioridad a las necesidades marcadas de las comunidades que han apoyado a las escuelas de Brooke, Metz y Sims. Es importante que ellos que han apoyado las escuelas tengan voz y voto en ese proceso. Tercero, pasamos todo un verano respondiendo encuestas en 2019 y después nos cerraron las escuelas. ¿Qué van a hacer ustedes con todos esos resultados de las encuestas? ¿Son las encuestas o una compañía privada? Muchísimas gracias y que apoyen la democracia y las necesidades de las comunidades aquí en Austin. Que tengan buen día. Adiósito y gracias.
This is an English interpretation of John McKiernan Gonzalez's comment. Good morning. My name is John McKiernan Gonzalez, parent of a student from Dawson. I am calling about agenda item 10.1 and the issue about the approval and the consulting about Austin ISD's real estate. First, that people who live close to Anita Coy have priority for public housing so the people are able to live here in Austin. Second, to prioritize the highlighted needs of the communities that have supported Brooke, Metz, and Sims elementary schools. It is important that these people who have supported the schools have a say in the process. Third, we spent the whole summer responding to surveys in 2019, and then the schools were closed. So what are you going to do with all those answers from the surveys? Is it the surveys or is it a private company? Thank you very much. Support democracy and support the needs of the communities here in Austin. Have a good day, goodbye, and thank you.
My name is Nancy Mims. I'm an AISD parent calling about item 10.1, contract for real estate consultant. I'm trying to understand why the district would sign off on a multi-year contract to fund a multinational business consultancy to steer major structural changes in this district without open public discussions on the processes, intentions, and larger goals. How is it possible that the board would consider greenlighting a third-party assessment of schools' real estate values using a tool based on commerce when we have yet to even commit to the third-party equity assessment that communities and leaders have been calling on for years to identify areas where the district can most effectively disrupt institutional and systemic racism and remove barriers to improving student outcomes for our most vulnerable students? I ask you to table this item and commit to reassessing board and district priorities through an anti-racist equity lens. Thank you.
This is Sharon Vane, and I'm the parent of two AISD high schoolers. My comment is on agenda item 10.1. As a parent in the district, I am troubled by the lack of clarity in communications from the district at a time when trust building is of paramount importance. We can take difficult news as parents. For example, with the pandemic, by now some of us know that decisions are being driven by TEA. But without context, it looks like the district is flip-flopping and not taking the clear recommendations of Austin Public Health. That lack of clarity and trust is also worrisome for consent item 10.1. Given the district's history and background with school closures, I urge you to offer full and clear context for that contract tonight before any vote takes place. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Terry Woodruff. I'm calling to leave a message on item 10.1. I'm asking the board to postpone the vote on this until there's clarity about the scope and the goal of the contract. It kind of feels like it's getting shoehorned in, and I think everyone has their hands full right now with the pandemic and schools to start to really focus in on something like this. It seems very expensive, and I would hope that the equity report and the equity audit gets put out before other things start taking precedence like this. This can wait. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Corey Wilson Barrera. I am a parent of a student at Barton Hills Elementary, and I'm calling to comment on item 10.1. I'm asking you to postpone the vote until there is clarity to the public about the scope and goal of this contract. The 2019 to 2020 school changes proposal failed to account for equity and educational outcomes. Before we enter into a contract regarding school closures, we must take into account both public and private needs to be reassured that we are making good decisions. Thank you.
My name is Christine Garanya, and I'm calling about 10.1 real estate contract. I want to thank the board for listening to my comments. I'm urging the board to postpone the vote on item 10.1 until there's clarity about the scope and goal of this contract. The 2019-2020 school changes proposal failed to account for equity and educational outcomes. School closures or repurposing must always take into account both first, and the public needs to be sure that this is happening. Public input and engagement should happen before consultants create plan. Otherwise, they are just selling us their ideas rather than authentically engaging the public, as has happened with school changes. I recognize the need for affordable housing, but education and equity must come first. And if it does, then the rest will follow. So please consider postponing the vote on 10.1 until public has the ability to examine this and fully engage with this. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your service.
Hello, my name is Vincent Tovar. I'm an AISD parent, and speaking to board item 10.1, I'm a parent at Go Valley Elementary and East Side High School, and want to advocate for low-income housing, affordable housing at school lots, starting with the Anita Coy Center, as privileged and affluent parents are threatening to leave the district over face-to-face instruction. We have low-income parents that are actually leaving the district because they can't afford to live in the city anymore. And so we need to make sure that we respect them. We need to stop outsourcing every service that we have in the district, like to Dallas ISD, like the chief school leadership's offices and all these chief officers, practically all the whole cabinet. And we need to respect
Trustees, this concludes our public testimony. Are there any questions or clarifications? Trustee Anderson.
Just more so a couple of comments. I know that item 10.1 was pulled, but if and when it is brought back, can you please include the why so the community understands that if anything, this is not an all of a sudden thing? Because my understanding it stems from the facilities master plan. I'm not sure, that's just my understanding.
Mr. Segura, can you speak to just the timing? I know we've pulled 10.1 for now, but I think some clarity is being requested around this particular item, and maybe you can help clear up what may be some misunderstanding.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Elzalde and the Board of Trustees. My name is Matias Segura. I'm the Operations Officer. And one of the things that I did want to provide as far as some background was that as part of any long-term planning effort, we want to have partners on board to help us inform decisions. One of the things that we've communicated to the board several times over the last year and a half, 2 years, was the need to have a thoughtful, collaborative engagement process to ultimately determine what our real estate strategies would be, not necessarily for just properties that were previously schools, but for other properties within the district that are that we need to look at to determine what the community benefit would be. And so one of the things that we had proposed was to bring this to the board and have a conversation around it. The COVID pandemic has really strained our ability to meet the planning timelines, and these types of planning efforts do take a good amount of time. So certainly welcome the opportunity to communicate in a great dialogue with the board, and it is part of a longer term planning effort, and more than happy to have that conversation as well.
And as you know, when and if it comes back up, community voices, of course, should always be at the front. I never want to assume that a community wants X and they want Y. So, as always, I would just request that whatever is considered, that the community have an opportunity to give feedback on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely, Trustee.
Trustee Liu?
So I just want to, not so much, well, there are a couple of questions, but I'll start with the comment first. So former trustee Ann Tyke, as well as some of the community members, highlighted the need for affordable housing. And when I was looking through the RFP as well as the proposal, I know that that was mentioned, but I thought that what I really appreciated about the comments from the public was that affordable housing was clearly defined. And so to the extent that this issue will come back again, maybe proactively having some definitions around what affordable housing means, and especially emphasizing family-friendly affordable housing. And then the other, so then I have another question. So in the contract, and I can go back and take a look at it, but when I was skimming through it, I don't remember seeing a clause that would say that the vendor could, obviously present and deliver a final, their final recommendations in the report, but then including a clause that would prohibit that vendor from then coming back and assisting with, the sale and the development of land, just wanting to make sure that there's no, not even the hint of potential, conflict of interest. So that's food for thought. And then the other thing is, I think one of the public commenters had mentioned, or maybe two of them, had mentioned the surveys from the school changes process. And one of the last things that I remember from school changes is that after the schools were closed, well, after the vote was taken to close the schools, a survey was opened up for each of the individual campuses that allowed us to pick from a drop-down list. And so I'm wondering if at any point in time that information can be made available to the public as to what were the results, I haven't seen that, and maybe I'm just not looking for it in the right place on the website, but can an update be provided to the public as well as to the board regarding those survey results?
Absolutely. Thank you, Trustee, for those comments. You know, to the first point regarding identifying, what are parameters around regarding affordable housing or workforce housing for that matter. One of the things I think is a great opportunity is identifying opportunities for teachers or for those that specifically work for AISD. And I think there's opportunities around that specifically because we own those assets. And I think those types of creative ideas can only be explored with partners that have that background, which is why consulting services are necessary. But we can work to define those parameters. On the second point, I guess the third point regarding providing an update and on the feedback that we received, we can absolutely do that. We previously provided update via executive sessions because it was a real estate item, but I can work with Dr. Elizalde and identify the proper way to communicate the information and make sure that it's available to whomever needs to review it. And as far as any issues regarding conflict of interest, one of the things that we endeavor to do is to ensure that these are not brokerage-related services, which is one thing I'm very mindful of. I do not want partners who are going to be compensated or rewarded based on the value. This needs to be the best solution for the district, and that's all that it needs to be, and our community. So, for that reason, we decided to proceed with consulting services opposed to brokerage-related services, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with that type of agreement. But we will go back. We will make some improvements to the language in the contract, and then have an open dialogue and bring that back at an appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Segura. I appreciate that.
Trustee Wagner?
I just wanted to ask one very quick clarifying question because it's something I heard coming up in the public comment and some of the emails we received, and that is, would this contract allow the superintendent to sell AISD properties without a board vote? I don't know if our attorney wants to answer that. Or...
Go ahead, Mr. Segura.
Yes, so the Board of Trustees are the owners by governance of all properties. So any lease agreements, any agreements whatsoever regarding any real estate absolutely must come to the board. This is one of the reasons that we bring to you all so many different easements and right-of-ways, as nuanced as they are, is because they are a real estate-related item. So absolutely any decision, any contract, any of those items must come before the board for approval. The superintendent cannot approve them without y'all.
Thank you.
Trustees, any other questions? Trustee Zapata?
So several of the speakers have asked for postponement. And what I'm hearing is it was taken off, so we're not going to take a vote, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So do we have a timeline of when we're thinking about bringing it back, number one? Number two, I know, Mr. Seguro, you mentioned about making sure it's community engagement. So what would that look like? Is that before bringing it back to us, have that conversation first, organize that community team to talk about this with you, so that there's that input before it comes to us?
Thank you, Mr. Zapata. One of the things that we laid out a while ago that we certainly need to bring back for the board is really a real estate strategy, and it included identifying groups in the community that were most closely aligned to the school, either by proximity or by affiliation, getting ideas, creatively exploring, what types of community benefit could be included. Also recognizing that there are multiple solutions based on the size of some of the tracks. And not all of them are ones that are, again, tied to schools. For instance, Rosedale is relocating, and there'll be a site that is up there that we certainly need to talk about. Ultimately, the way this was going to go, and I can bring this back to the board, was we would get feedback from the community with stakeholders that are closely tied to some of these sites. We would, at the same time, with what with working with the city of Austin, identify what we might be able to actually include on the site. Obviously, there are site development requirements, there are construction limitations, there are height limitations. So there's certain things that we just simply won't be able to do. And the goal was, as community input came in, we could actually present back ideas that we could actually execute. And so one of the things that we'll bring back to you after I work with Dr. Elizalde on a refined schedule is recognizing that, you know, we want to provide feedback to the community, and having a partner like this helps us do that. If we wait to get to all the way through the end without a partner that can help us test some of these ideas, I think you'll find that this process will go on for a very long time. And I'm concerned that, you know, if the board does ask for a recommendation, we may not be prepared to provide one. And so it's really kind of having these two things work in tandem. As far as when it comes back, I'll work with Dr. Elizalde and define a timeline. But again, it's not incredibly urgent, meaning that it can be postponed. But I do want to bring it back before too long and have a larger conversation.
Thank you.
Trustee Zapata, just a couple context things. One is this board did vote to put a moratorium on the sale of school properties for 2 years. And in addition, typically what happens when an item is pulled off the agenda, we'll have a discussion with Dr. Elizalde of whether or not it should be put to the next board information session. Therefore, they can provide more information, and the board can provide feedback to them about whether or not it would be moved to the voting meeting or not. So I think those are all discussions. Since it's pulled, we'll have a discussion with the administration from a governance perspective of what the right timing is in the near future. You're welcome. I don't know if you had another question or no? Okay. Trustee Boswell?
I just have a quick question, Mr. Segura. I didn't see in the proposal, and it's possible that I missed it, a list of the properties that that you're hoping to have evaluated. That would be helpful to have as well when we come back to this. And if I missed it, I would love for you to tell me where it is. Thank you.
No, Trustee Boswell, you bring up a very good point. The consulting agreement is structured in a way that allows us to introduce properties as the board sees fit. You know, it's not predetermined which ones. It just determined that, you know, we have some resources set aside for the consulting team to help us explore various solutions. So, you know, maybe one of the things we can talk about is providing a framework around those, but ultimately a real estate strategy across many of our assets is really, you know, the initial idea, not necessarily identifying specific sites at this time, just knowing that there are some that will and some that may not go as early as others. And again, we can have that conversation later in an information session if the board and Dr. Elizalde, I think that it makes sense for us to do that.
Thank you.
And Trustee Boswell, just for context, typically our real estate conversations that deal with specific sites are in executive session just because of the competitive nature of the sale of them or other issues that might come up from a legal perspective. So we will have a robust discussion typically on individual sites, but it's more in the executive session than the larger community conversation now around what the board has also prioritized around workforce housing, as Matias mentioned, or affordable housing, as well as some of the options that legally we're able to do as well. So these are great questions, by the way, from all of y'all. Trustees, any other questions? So that concludes the public testimony part. As a reminder to our community, please feel free to share any general comments or questions on non-voting items with the board by email at trustees@austinisd.org. We will now move to the consent agenda. The administration has pulled agenda items 10.1 and agenda item 11.7. Staff have shared they will send additional information regarding item 10.1 before bringing it back for consideration. And are there any other consent items that trustees would like to pull for a separate vote? And I'd like to first start off with, if there's not any objection in pulling item 10.2, because there are some executive session questions or legal questions on there. Without objection, we'll pull that one for a vote after our executive session, if that's okay with our trustees. Unless someone has a question. And so, are there any other consent items that trustees would like to pull for a consent, for a separate vote? Trustee Boswell.
I have a question about 10.2. I think the community has had some questions about that. And if we're going to have discussion before executive session, I would like to ask whatever questions the community has. I think a lot of questions remaining from that September 28th meeting that were not answered. I would love to have the chance to answer what we can in public session now before we go to executive session, so people don't have to wait through that if that is possible.
It is, the only thing I would say is, would you mind asking your question and then pausing to have our board counsel make sure that that's not a question for executive session or not? So we can have the conversation around that, but I think there are some executive session questions. So we'll have that when we do the separate vote. We'll have that discussion in there. Yeah, you're welcome. Trustees, any other items that we'd like to pull from the consent items for a separate vote?
10.8, which is crisis intervention training for AISD police officers.
And that's as it's titled, Resolution to Accept Justice Assistance Grant Funds Through Governor's Office?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. 10.8. Trustee Foster has pulled item 10.8. Is there a second for that item? Okay, by Trustee Lugo. Okay, any other items? Okay, so Secretary Singh, I hope you followed that because do you have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I do. I'm invoking the spirit of Trustee Amber Ellens. I've seen her do this so many times. So I make a motion to approve consent agenda items 10.3 through 10.7 and 11.1 through 11.6 and 12.1, excuse me. And 12.1 to 12.2. Oh, did I miss? Oh, I'm so sorry, see? Thank you. 8.1 through 9.7 as well.
Okay.
Shall I repeat that? Or did you get it?
I got it. I think
Okay.
I think I got it, and I'll say it again when we do the motion. So is there a second?
Second.
Trustee Anderson. Okay. So trustees, is there any discussion on any of these consent agenda items? So if not.
Oh, I have something.
Yep.
So I had some questions regarding the budget amendment report, item 10.4. Just some questions for our administration on that.
Mr. Throng, are you there? Just want to make sure
Sure.
not to repeat.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. Trustee Singh has some questions regarding some amendments. Trustee Singh.
Thank you. So the first question I had, it seems like there is some increase in the facilities maintenance and operations, and it was somewhat substantial. So I just wanted to get a sense of what that was.
Okay. Facilities maintenance and construction. There's no change to facilities maintenance and construction.
Okay, wait, hold on.
Oh, I see. Hold it. Yes. Facility maintenance and operations, function 51. increases by $1.3 million. And that is for the purchase of some generators. And FEMA is, if we buy this and buy these generators, FEMA will reimburse us for 75% of the cost of those generators.
Okay.
So that would be, $782,000, it looks like to me, something like that.
Okay. And then I also noticed, if I'm reading this correctly, that our recapture payment went up higher than we had budgeted. Is that because of the drop in enrollment?
That's a function of it. But the main reason that the recapture payment went up from $606 million to $677 million, an increase of $71,530,000. After we make estimates of how much money we're going to collect in taxes, and then we wait. Of course, we set the tax rate, and then in November we get the levy from the tax collector and how much money we're actually going to receive. And when we got that information, probably the end of November, when they mailed out all of the tax statements to the community, we're going to collect $79,367,000 of additional tax funds. Okay? But we can't keep all those. We can't keep but 6 or 7 million of it. And the other 71 million is what we have to increase, is caused by the increase of the tax collections and an estimated drop of something like 2,000 kids in average daily attendance.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. And the last question I had was regarding the fund balance. If I'm reading this correctly, it looks like there has not been a change in our budgeted fund balance. Is that correct?
I think that if we look at the bottom of the page number 1 there, the first column, it says adopted budget, July 1, 2020.
Yes.
Okay, all the way at the bottom, it says estimated $185,526,000. Now, if we go all the way to the right on the bottom, you can say if you approve the budget as of January 31st, 2021, the change is it's $2 million. The unassigned fund balance goes up $2 million from that 185 to 187 million.
Okay, so it's actually, our fund balance has actually increased then.
The unassigned fund balance did increase by $2 million. If you look up, but there's other parts, as you are well aware, in the fund balance. Back to that first column over there, projected fund balance, that's not the unassigned, but the total fund balance was estimated to be $220 million.
Okay.
Now, if you go all the way across to the right, the comparable number is $215 million. So the total fund balance went down an additional $5 million. That's a true statement. And if you go to the bottom, you can say yes, not yes, but yes, and the unassigned went up $2 million to $187 million. Does that make sense?
I think so. Okay, so the assigned fund balance went down, right? It went down from, the approved budget was about 35 million, and now it's at 26 million plus.
The assigned fund balance, yes, because we spent some of it.
Okay, so I guess, can you remind us what our policy states should be the percentage in our fund balance, and since it has dropped a little bit, are we at risk of running up against the threshold that we've set for ourselves?
I think that answer to your question, the number I believe is 20%. Your unassigned is what the policy speaks to, if I remember correctly, and it's 20%. You strive to have 20%, and I believe we're going to be about there at the end of the year. But we'll find out in our February report. We give you each year. It's our practice to give the board an estimate of 2, 3, 4 years out.
Okay.
This is an estimate just of the current year, but we also we will in February make an estimate what it's going to look like at the end of 22, at the end of 23, and at the end of 24.
Okay. All right. So it sounds like we're not in any danger. Is that correct?
We're not in any danger
Okay,
right now.
that's all I
but
need to know.
there is some indication in the future, though, that if we continue the level of spending in the general fund that we're doing, we will run out of money.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on the discussion items for, any more discussion on any of the consent items? Trustees, if not, having a motion by Secretary Singh and a second by Trustee Anderson to approve consent agenda items 8.1 to 9.7, 10.3 through 10.7, 11.1 through 11.6, and 12.1 through 12.2, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. And the motion passes by all those on the dais. Now we'll move to those items pulled from the agenda. And let's start with item 10.2. I'm sorry, 10.8. Let's see. So Trustee Singh, do we have a motion? Yep, do we have a motion?
President Rodriguez, was that for 10.8? 10.8. Yes, I move to approve agenda item 10.8, resolution to accept Justice Assistant Grant funds through the Governor's Office.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, Trustee Anderson. So let's see, any questions or comments? And Trustee Foster, you had a comment.
Sure, and I can hopefully dispose of this rather quickly. So this is JAG funding, so this is Justice Assistance Grant funding that, is part of a much larger program. We've been getting money through this programming for a long time. This particular JAG programming is to train up our police officers in moments of crisis intervention, specifically around mental health issues. So on one hand, I want to affirmatively vote for support of our officers in this way. At the same time, as we support that type of funding, I also want to reaffirm the things we've learned over the last couple of years about over-policing and privileging or putting forth our officers as first responders to mental health circumstances. So I'm in favor of, over time, and I think we've all at different points expressed favoring more counselors on campuses, more strategies and resource investment that would have police not as the first go-tos, but that would have teachers well equipped to deal with emotional outbursts, that would have others on campus equipped so that we don't put things first and foremost as something that has to do with policing, which leads to criminalization, et cetera. So I want to vote for this, but I want to, and I will vote for this, but with the understanding that this is part of a broader set of strategies when it comes to serving our kids and their mental health needs.
Thank you, Trustee Foster. Any other discussion, questions? Trustee Zapata?
I totally agree with what you're saying, Trustee Foster, because there is a first aid mental health training that every staff person should go through to be able to ensure that any staff person can be that first responder and not have to make it a criminal case for our students. So I don't know if staff do have first aid mental health training. It's like first aid for lifeguards, but this is really looking at how they identify signs, and they don't have to be the expert on what to do, but at least they have an idea of, this student needs to be helped and not expelled.
I think this speaks to an earlier conversation we had with regard to our entire mental health kind of umbrella and ensuring that we are working first with individuals that have direct contact with students initially. So whether it's, our cafeteria employees or a bus driver or a teachers or a teacher assistant or an office receptionist, and then how we have a continuum of services so that those do identify those types of behaviors that would alarm someone to refer someone to a counselor, and then if it's that serious, that a counselor would know how to call for a threat assessment, so that from there we would know. And that's exactly, I think, again, the similarities in our expectations are aligned. And this is only for the purposes of ensuring that if officers have to provide support, that they, in fact, when that is called upon, that they do have that training, but that this should not in any way substitute for individual staff members who should be the first line of interaction with our students. We hear you and we agree with you 100%. So we will continue to move in that area and arena. This is also about working and bringing in our campus leaders and having them work collectively with our officers. It's also about making sure we don't ask officers to do things that puts them in a situation of needing to intervene and asking ourselves, are there things that we need to assist our campus leaders in how we're managing situations rather than criminalizing by having police come and intervene in situations where that may have been what was originally thought this would be the way to do it, and now we know so much better about how we need to interact. So again, I just want to reaffirm what all of you are bringing to our attention.
I really appreciate that, and you were so much more eloquent than I in expressing that, and that's exactly what I wanted to hear and have affirmed, and that I wanted our community to hear as well. So thank you so much.
And Integral Care provided first aid mental health training for free for the entire campus at Eastside Memorial. And I also did it with parents and community. So that's a resource that I know, talking to Mr. Evans, the executive director, that, they still do that. So thank you.
And trustees, from a governance perspective, this sounds like a topic I know all of us have an interest in, the mental health. In the last year, we've had at least one briefing on the mental health strategy for AISD, and I just wonder if maybe we can put that on one of our conversations, Dr. Lizalde, about having a briefing on the mental health strategies, because there's a lot to this, either it's social emotional learning, our item 10.2, and there are other aspects to all of this, so there's a lot to it. So, and I think with our new cadre of trustees, it probably is a good time to schedule another briefing around that issue.
Yes, sir.
Trustees, any other questions on? If not, having a motion by Trustee Singh and a second by Trustee Anderson to approve agenda item I'm sorry, to approve item 10.8. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. And the motion passes by all those on the dais. Trustee Singh, do I have a motion for item 10.2?
Yes, I move that we approve item 10.2, approval of a contract for school mental health centers at elementary, middle, and high schools.
Do I have a second? Was that Trustee Lugo? Oh, Trustee Zapata. Okay. So trustees, any questions? And I'll recognize Trustee Boswell.
Thank you. Yes, my questions, I went back and watched, sorry, again. I went back and watched the September 28th meeting when this was on the agenda and was pulled, and really have a lot of the same questions that were asked that day. Trustee Wagner had asked questions and framed it really in the same way that I feel about it, that these are really a valued asset in our community. They've been in place for a while now and are serving thousands of students on dozens of campuses, serving our staff, and just wanting to be sure that whatever is coming next is serving, doing a good job. And some of the questions that I saw remaining from that meeting were, it's a $2.2 million contract now, and it's not entirely clear from the RFP or the agreement what that money will be used for. Second thing is, at the September 28th meeting, there was a plan for it taking 3 months to get up to half the number of therapists they expected to need, and 6 months to get fully up to the number they expected to need. So I would love to know if that timeline is still relevant. And then, kind of capacity and experience of the organization. Is this something that they have experience with this population at this scale? Is that something, and it may be that these questions were answered to trustees between September and when I joined the board, and that I'm just catching up. But before I vote, I would love to know the answers to that.
Sure.
And other people may have other questions. Thank you.
Ms. Casas, I know you and Ms. Copeland worked on this. After we had an initial conversation in September with regard to the requirements and why we were needing to go out for an RFP, could you answer the question with regard to our timeline? I think maybe that's the first question, is with regard to the timeline of, we had asked for a 3-month extension with our current provider. Could you bring us up to date?
Yes, so in the September board meeting, there was a lot of questions about the RFP that was being brought forward. And it didn't sound like we had a lot of clear answers. And so at that time, since there was a lot of new leadership, myself and Dr. Lizaldi, Ms. Copeland was new to her position too within the last few months, we decided to cancel that original RFP and issue a new RFP. We went back, we looked at the scope of services and the work that we were asking for the vendor. And then we reached out to all of the vendors that provide this type of service, including our current vendor, and we issued the new RFP. And so the original intent was to try to extend our current contract through the end of June of this year so that we can have time to really dig into the RFP process and the transition process. However, after negotiation, we were only able to extend the current contract through February of this year. And therefore, that created that urgency to issue the RFP and get through the process so that we can identify how we're going to move forward as a district to not interrupt services.
Thank you. And in September, the vendor that we're considering today said it would take 6 months from the time the agreement was signed to get fully up to speed. What is the plan for not interrupting services? Is that still the case, that it will take that long for them to hire and get all the agreements in place, get everything, the insurance agreements, all of that?
So I will start and then I'll let Ms. Copeland jump in. So the urgency right now to get this approved tonight is so that we can finalize the contract. The contract that you have included as the attachment is basically the final contract. There was still some language that they were asking for in terms of the COVID procedures and policies that we implement here in the district, but there are no changes to the contract. The other thing is that the parents have been notified through the current vendor that they have three options. They can continue with the current vendor, they can sign on with the new vendor, or they can seek other outside resources in the community. And so in this transition process, we will have to identify how many families want to transition to the new vendor, how many will stay with the former vendor. But right now, Gramercy is at 48 schools across Texas, and so they're ready and able to provide teletherapy immediately. And then as we start to transition back into face-to-face clinic services, then it'll give us a little bit of time to figure out how many families we need to transition to, how many will continue either with the current vendor, with the new vendor, or seek outside services. So we're still in the data collection phase to see what it's going to take to ramp up the services. But they are a vendor that's already doing this type of service in other schools across Texas.
Thank you. And doing it at other schools, and they have the capacity to take as many students as will choose them right away via telehealth. Is that the feeling?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, and let's remember that what's unique to Austin is that we have our internal mental health clinics within Austin ISD. Normally, districts use a service provider outside of the district, and they refer students out. So this is a bit of a unique situation with Austin, that we do provide this service for our families. And so we looked for other districts that had a similar type model, and it was difficult because most districts do, like I said, refer students out to community services.
Yeah, I appreciate that model, and I know a lot of families have used it, and staff as well, and really benefited. So thank you for that. My only question that remains is it's not entirely clear to me what the $10.2 million is used for. Is that used to cover students who don't have insurance in the fee-for-service model? Where is that money going? That's not entirely clear to me.
Okay. Ms. Copeland, if you could speak a little bit more to the specifics of the service agreement.
Yes, absolutely. So the $10.2 million is over 5 years. And so we use that $10.2 million in the district to cover our uninsured clients. And so in the fee-for-service model, most people will use their insurance. And so historically, most mental health providers use a fee-for-service model in the community. And they usually see about 80% insured and 20% uninsured. And so we are going by that model. We also have done consultant work there. Melissa Rowan is also, I think she's on the call too. And so that would cover to make sure that our students and our adults and our families that fall under that do not have insurance, that they are able to be covered and get services through the school mental health centers.
Thank you.
All right, so I have 3 questions, and I'll pause after each one to see what's available for public consumption. So my first one, let's kind of build off of the last statement. So using the fee-for-service model, my understanding is that the VDAC clinic services were paid for using multiple funding sources. So where are we getting the $10 million from over the 5 years? I mean, I understand that it's over 5 years.
So I'm going to start, and then Melissa, you're going to have to help because I wasn't around at that time. But originally, we were using 1115 waiver Medicaid money to fund most of it. And then the VOCA grant was intended to, as most grants are, to start up services in the district. And then every year they take back, they give less and less money so that the district can sustain the initiative on their own. And I believe in 2019, April of 2019, the district hired a consultant to come in and help us figure out how are we going to build a model that was sustainable, and that's where this fee-for-service model came from.
Okay, so that didn't entirely answer the question about where the funding is coming from for the new contract.
moving forward. So one of the other items on the board agenda today was the VOCA grant money. So we're asking permission from the grant to accept the 400,000. So that's where part of the money will come from. Lexi, do you want to speak to the rest of the funding?
Yes, so we fund the school mental health centers through the VOCA grant funding and through local funding. So the $10.2 million that we're asking for is for local funding. As Ms. Casas mentioned, the grant funding is not meant to be permanent. And so we want to make sure that the school mental health centers are sustainable and that they continue even after we do not have grant funding anymore. And so that will cover it. Any additional funding that we do have under this fee-for-service model, we may be able to expand as well as cover additional hardships for students in the district.
Okay, thank you. And then my next question is, help me figure out, maybe this was somewhere in the documents, but does Gramercy accept all Medicaid providers and MCOs? Do we know?
From my understanding, they do.
And then my last question. So just from a kind of organizational practice, and this may be, I'm going to ask and then you tell me. So I would love to understand what procurement policies and best practices AISD is following when there's an RFP that will result in a multi-year $10 million contract and there's one vendor.
So we may need Larry Throm to help us with that. I'm not really sure about the procurement rules.
Yeah, you can speak in general to it.
Would you repeat the question, please?
Sure thing. So what kinds of procurement policies and best practices does AISD follow when there's an RFP that's a multi-year RFP, and in this particular instance, it's a $10 million multi-year RFP that's going to result in a multi-year $10 million contract, but there's one vendor. I mean, I'm aware of
It's not uncommon when we bid out that there's only one vendor. We go to great efforts to advertise our procurement process out there and seek vendors. But sometimes on narrowly focused specialty, there may be only one vendor, and you can't, and that vendor has followed all the guidelines, can provide all the services. Vendor's reputable, been around a long time, and you would award that to that vendor. There isn't another vendor to award it to.
So this is interesting and maybe something that we can do some follow-up on because there are best practices to follow when you have a multi-year. I mean, so my understanding is from the training that I received as a state contract manager and negotiator. And so I just remember from a handful of years ago, and you probably remember this, Larry, it was all over the news, HHSC got seriously slapped because they weren't following best practices around procurements and multi-year, multi-million-dollar contracts. So I just want to kind of understand how AISD, in particular, something as sensitive as providing mental health services over several years for this particular amount. This would be totally different if it was, $100,000 for 2 years. But this is pretty significant. So that's where I'm coming from.
Trustee Lugo.
And if I could add, at the September meeting, because there were so many questions, that was really, we wanted to be fair to all of the vendors, and so we canceled the original RFP and issued the second one to make sure that all of the vendors understood that we were opening it up again, and anybody that wished to apply was able to during the time frame that they were open.
I might just add here, Trustee Lou, if I'm recalling the right HHSC contract, that was a sole source contract that was made by the governmental entity to choose one entity themselves. The difference here is that there is a request for proposal that was open to everyone. That we also have particular procurement policies that I think we can share. And I think there are certain legal services or others that while we can do sole sourcing, for example, our board counsel, we do an RFP process through it. And I think we're open to hearing about other best practices, because I think for us, I think there's an understanding that the RFP process is one of the best practices. Even if you don't have to do it, we go above and beyond that. But I think you bring up a good point of just making sure that we know where we stand. Dr. Lizardo?
Well, I want to make sure Trustee Lugo got her questions asked that she did before I make a comment. Was there, because I think you had several, so I didn't want to interrupt that.
Yeah, and I think just kind of going off of what President Rodriguez said, yeah, I completely agree that particular HHSC instance, it was totally, there's reasons why they got there's reasons why there was legislation that followed.
Yes.
The only reason I brought that up is because, then we had a whole set of training we had to go through, and so I'm looking out for the district, that's all. Yeah. But yes, ma'am, my questions have been answered.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to make note that a previous provider also had a multi-year contract. And then secondly, what happens if we don't take action? Because I think all of the comments about how we can improve the process, we absolutely want to dive into those. But I want to be time sensitive of where we are with regard to services to our clients. Ms. Casas or Ms. Copeland, if we do not get approval for this, what will happen?
So the current service agreement ends at the end of February, and so if we do not move forward at this time, then there will be an interruption of services.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure, because I think that's important in the decision-making process.
So the trustees, Trustee Anderson?
Thank you for this. This is something that is deeply near and dear to me, that I stress all the time to my board members about their mental health. And so I have 2 questions and a comment. So my first question is, as I look through, and maybe I missed it, can you tell me what services will be provided?
Yes, Ms. Copeland, do you want to speak to the specifics of the service agreement?
Yes. So the main service that will be provided is direct clinical therapy to students and staff in the district. So we know that we have a lot of mental health supports in the district, but one thing that we wanted to make sure that was focused on in this newest RFP and this newest contract was that we had that direct clinical therapy there. We have built in child advocacy hours as well. So we want to make sure that we're supporting the whole child. So child advocacy means participation in child study team meetings and other meetings like that, to make sure that they are able to give input to be able to support the students and staff.
And my next question is, in looking at the services provided, what, if anything, will be put into there related to mental health emergencies? Say you have a student who's having a mental health crisis, and for whatever reason, the campus doesn't have a therapist. And so how will we ensure that, during that student's mental health crisis, that they won't fall through the cracks and getting needed services and supports?
So I will mention, we mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the things that is a high priority for us is really identifying those continuum of services of when does the teacher hand it off to the counselor hand it off to MTSS coach, and then when does they get transferred over to the mental health team. Lexi, can you talk to us about crisis? How do we handle crisis at the campus level?
Yes, so that is one thing that we have built into this new contract is crisis support. So if we have a child that has been seeing a therapist and there is a crisis that happens with that student, then that therapist is able to jump in and help with that collaborative effort with crisis. So we will continue to follow our district crisis protocols with the counseling department, as well as our licensed mental health professionals. And now we have an added support in there with the therapists with the school mental health centers. So we did want to make sure that we added that into the new contract because that is important that all of those different key players are added in there.
So, under a mental health center service requirements, where it says collaborate with director of health services, project director, and/or school mental health coordinators regarding the addition or elimination of therapists, the transfer of therapists between campuses, the addition of campus mental health centers, etc. Contractor will remain in communication with the district school mental health coordinators regarding day-to-day operational information impacting the ability for contractors to provide direct clinical services on campus. So I read that statement and reread it, and I sat back and it kind of troubled me. It doesn't mention counselors. To my knowledge, to my understanding, once the teacher sends the student to the counselor is there in the beginning, the counselor is there doing, and the counselor is there after. But yet, when you look at this statement, it makes no mention of the counselor. Somewhere in this district, I'm gonna call it a disconnect. There's a disconnect because there's this thought that counseling has nothing to do with mental health, and it does. And so this statement right here should include the counselor. The counselor is there with that student at the beginning, middle, and all the way through. So your counselor needs to be included in that collaborative effort, so your counselor can know what's going on in case that therapist that, you know, for whatever reason is no longer gonna be on the campus, the counselor will be there with that student. So don't miss the opportunity to include the counselors in this collaboration because they're there. They will be there before the therapist and after. So please include them in this discussion. And I'm also going to request Dr. Elizalde that 6 months, should this pass, 6 months into it, that we get some type of review to know how many students are actually being serviced, how many students are actually being referred. That's my request. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Anderson. Trustee Lugo?
Yes, thank you, Trustee Anderson. And kind of related to that update, learning about, you know, how the performance will be evaluated. So not just the numbers of students, but, you know, some sort of qualitative, or even if there's like research-based evaluations that, you know, have been used to assess other school mental health centers, or maybe that AISD has used. I would love to kind of have that be made available. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Lugo. Trustee Zapata?
I just want to add that there should be, you know, I had mentioned before at another meeting about creating a student handbook so that students can self-refer as well, or parents can know there is the therapist help there. I didn't know that there was one at Eastside Memorial until I went around and introduced myself to everybody. And there were parents that really wanted to know how to help their children. So it doesn't have to be a burst out event in the classroom or anything, But sometimes, parents just want to know there's help in the school. And so there could be, if there's a handbook for students to know the resources, so parents know that they have access, that would also be very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Zapata. Trustee Singh?
Thank you so much for this robust discussion. I had a couple of questions, and feel free to let me know if these are more appropriate for executive session. But Ms. Casas, you had mentioned that parents would be given 3 options. Do you mind repeating those? And I guess what I'm getting towards is what efforts are being made to allow the clients to continue on with the same therapist at least through the end of this school year, and even if we switch to Gramercy?
So our current vendor contacted every single client that they had to let them know of the 3 options to continue with the current vendor, transfer services to the new vendor, or seek outside agency support. And so knowing that sometimes communication doesn't get where it needs to, on our end, we have notified the principals and the school counselors to notify them of this change so that the counselors can be on the lookout for students that need new referrals, because at some point the previous vendor is going to stop taking new clients, and then we'll transition to the new vendor. Yeah.
Okay. And then do you know if Gramercy will be making efforts to hire the VITA therapists so that our students could continue with them?
Yes, they're very open to hiring the therapist, yes.
Okay. All right. And let's see. I think those are most of the questions. I know that I had submitted some questions. Or is there anything that has not already been discussed that could be relevant to this discussion? That was
I
to
can
Ms.
think of,
Casas.
unless there's any specific questions. And unless there's some specific questions, I'm not sure what else we can add.
Okay. All right. I think I'm good for now. Thank you.
So just a quick clarification, Trustee Singh, do we need to go to exec session for some additional questions, or are we good to vote?
So I guess I think I'm ready to vote. I did have some questions about maybe lessons learned or, differences between this contract and the VITA contract. I don't think that discussion would impact my vote, but would we be allowed to discuss that after a vote?
I think we
Or
can.
what's the recommendation?
Yeah, and I'm going to look to our board counsel, Christine. Can we, when we do our exec session, after we just voted this, can we provide additional input that's exec session appropriate to the superintendent?
Strictly speaking, if you're needing attorney-client consultation in order to help you do a vote, I think it's a little bit awkward if you go ahead and vote.
Oh, you don't know, Mike.
I was just gonna say, I think if there are additional questions that you want to take in terms of an attorney-client consultation, we probably ought to do that prior to a vote. Just as a matter of form. If we've already covered the item, going back to it in executive session, I think is a little awkward.
Could we maybe just get a sense from the trustees if they feel like they need to do that? And I'll go with the will of the board.
So, yes.
Well, I just wanted to know, and looking at the trustee tracker to see what questions that come in, I think yours were the only questions I had seen come through. And I also just want to be sure too that if we're looking for a comparison of the previous contract to the contract that's being brought forward for vote tonight, that might be something that administration could supply as a reference point if there is enough trustee interest in that, as opposed to Christine's point about it may not fit really within the confines of executive session at this point.
So trustee Anderson, trustee Foster, are you all ready to vote? You are, trustees? Ashley? Yes, thumbs up. Trustee Boswell? Not yet? Oh, you're ready to vote? I'm ready to vote. Okay, sorry, you're ready to vote, got it. And then trustee Zapata? Okay, all right, so.
Same.
Okay, so if there are any other questions, if there's not any other questions, having a motion by trustee Singh and a second by trustee Zapata to approve item 10.2, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. So the motion passes by all those on the dais. We are now going to move to the items for separate vote. I'd like to provide a reminder for our community on why we sometimes have items listed under separate vote. This can occur for two reasons. One, trustees may have requested before the final posting of an agenda to pull an item so the board can have discussion and ask questions. This would allow the board to consider the consent agenda without discussion and then move to those items which may include discussion. The second is items are listed for separate vote to allow a trustee to refrain from voting for an item. This typically occurs because a trustee may have a potential conflict of interest or another need to be excused from the vote. Listing it as a separate vote allows them to vote on consent and then excuse themselves from the individual items, usually by abstaining on the vote. And tonight we have two items for separate vote. Trustee Singh, do we have a motion?
Yes, I move we approve items 13.1 and 13.2.
Is there a second?
Second.
Trustees, there is any discussion on any of these consent items? Having a motion by Secretary Singh and a second by Trustee Anderson to approve items 13.1 and 13.2, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. All those opposed, all those abstaining. So the motion passes 8-0, showing Trustee Foster off the dais. And so before we go into executive session, I just want to ask the trustees for a little bit of grace. In the comment period, it turns out that there are 3 comments we didn't listen to. And I would like to ask you all, without objection, to listen to those 3 comments before we go to executive session for 2 reasons. 2 of them are on item 10.1, which doesn't impact our agenda. One of the comments is on item 11.3. So legally, based on advice from our board counsel, we need to do a separate motion to vote for item 11.3, which was on our consent agenda. So 11.3, which is approval of the contract for HVAC replacement at Williams Elementary School. Well, we voted for it in consent, but we didn't, legally, we have to listen to any public comment before it passes. So that vote is invalid, and so we need to go back and vote for that particular item. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so Dan, would you mind sharing the 3 comments for the board?
Hello, my name is Lisa Flores. I'm calling on regular voting item 10.1. In the absence of board operations meetings, it's very difficult to understand what is being placed on the school board agenda for a vote. I fail to see the urgency of a hundreds of $1,000s real estate contract at this time when so many audits around student outcomes are pending, like the third-party equity audit. I feel like it would be a more meaningful use of taxpayer funds to put that towards student outcomes. I ask the board resume broadcasting board operations meetings and delay the vote on this item. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eric Ramos, and I'm calling about consent agenda item 10.1. And I want to talk about the contract for a new real estate consultant. First off, I hope we can pull this item to be discussed separately before voting on the entire consent agenda. I also want to make sure that if we're going to approve a consultant, that they have a history of working on getting affordable housing into big cities. Affordable housing is desperately needed, especially in East Austin right now. And when I say affordable housing, I mean units with 3 bedrooms at 50 to 60% of median family income, which would be about $700 to $800 a month in rent. We need this in East Austin if we want to stabilize the attendance in our schools. If we truly value keeping these schools safe and keeping them populated, we need the housing, and we need it now. We cannot delay this. Every time we delay, we lose more and more families. So let's act on this now and ensure that the consultant takes into consideration bringing affordable housing on lots, specifically ones like the Anita Coy facility. And Hello, my name is Eric Ramos, and I'm calling to speak on consent agenda item 11.3, the approval of HVAC at Williams Elementary. And I want to start off by saying I am very happy that Williams Elementary, and I see other schools getting improvements to their HVAC. However, I would like to request that we get some sort of public update on the HVAC situation over at Martin Middle School. We've had years where we do not have reliable air conditioning or heat in the winter. Currently, it's about 80 degrees in my classroom. We keep getting messages that the problems are fixed. However, I have never been at the school and had it to where every room in the school is at the same normal, comfortable temperature. We currently have a temporary unit in our parking lot that does not seem to be helping. So if we could get some sort of update on that situation, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, trustees. Are there any questions or clarifications on the comments? I think all of us can probably agree that we were going to ask the superintendent for an update about Martin Middle School.
No.
If there's not any other questions or clarifications, then trustee Singh, do I have a motion for item number 11.3?
Yes, I move that we approve item 11.3.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Having a motion by trustee Singh in support of agenda item 11.3 and a second by trustee Ashe. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
So the comment about, you want to see what's going to happen in Martin.
Mike, please.
Is that?
Oh, your mic.
What the question at the end about, we want to know what's happening at Martin, could that be part of this? What do you say, motion?
The motion is for the agenda item itself. I think when we ask the trustees for questions or clarifications, that's when we ask the superintendent whether she can provide an update, and she's agreed to provide that update to us. So
Okay.
usually there's a written follow-up that
Okay.
will have a description of what the
Okay.
follow-up is and all that.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Trustees, any other questions or clarifications? If not, trustee Ashe made a motion to approve agenda item 11. Trustee Singh, sorry. Trustee Singh made a motion to approve agenda item 11.3, seconded by trustee Ashe. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. And the motion passes, and all those against, all those abstaining, the motion passes 8-0-0, showing trustee Letitia Anderson off the dais. Thank you all, trustees, for entertaining the last item there. We will now recess the open meeting at 9:37 p.m. and move to executive session pursuant to Texas Government Code sections 551.074, 551.072, 551.073, 551.087, 551.076, 551.0821, 551.129, and 551.071. For purposes of this video meeting, the board will now leave this open meeting, which will remain live online and convene privately in a separate video meeting. When we are finished with our executive session, we will reconvene here. And again, we thank you for your patience. Good morning. We will now reconvene the open meeting at 12:51 a.m. Secretary Singh, do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Is there a second? Yes. Having a motion by Secretary Singh and a second by Trustee Boswell to adjourn, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. And the motion passes by all those on the dais. The meeting is now adjourned at 12:51 a.m. Thank you.